I stood on the curb outside the courthouse, the eviction notice still warm in my hand. The scent of rain on hot stone reminded me that the place we had called home for 20 years was no longer ours. A distant car horn blared, muffled by the rain, and I felt the damp chill of the pavement seep through my thin coat. I pulled the coat tighter, the wool rough against my neck, and took a breath that smelled of wet concrete and distant exhaust. My husband Richard stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my elbow, his face set in a line I had not seen since the day we first walked into that courthouse together. He whispered, "We will get through this, Eleanor." His voice was low, steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it, the way his breath hitched, just a fraction, when he spoke. I nodded, not trusting my own voice to stay steady, and let him guide me toward the marble steps of the building where the ceremony was to begin. The great doors of Prescott Marine Logistics headquarters loomed ahead, their bronze handles polished to a shine that caught the weak morning light. As we stepped inside, the air changed instantly, cool and scented with polished wood, and a faint hint of lemon oil that seemed to cling to every surface. The murmur of voices rose like a tide, a low hum of conversation punctuated by the occasional clink of a coffee cup. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on us, not unkind but curious, as if they sensed something had shifted in the air around us. Richard paused at the reception desk, his fingers tapping a quiet rhythm on the polished granite. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his tone polite but distant. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears, smiled and replied, "Good morning, Mr. Prescott. The hall is ready. The guests are waiting." She glanced at me, her clipboard in hand, then added, "Your wife looks radiant today." I forced a smile, the muscles in my cheeks aching from the effort, and thanked her before we continued. We walked down a corridor lined with framed photographs of ships braving stormy seas, each image captured in stark black and white that made the spray look like frozen glass. The floor beneath our feet was cool marble, its veins of gray catching the light with each step we took. A soft jazz tune drifted from hidden speakers, the saxophone notes low and mournful, weaving through the chatter like a secret. I could feel the rhythm of it in my chest, a slow beat that matched the uneasy thrum of my own heart. Richard stopped before a set of double doors, turned to face me, and placed his hands on my shoulders. His grip was firm, his thumbs pressing into the cloth of my blouse just above my collarbone. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. I wanted to believe him, to let the words settle like dust on a shelf, but the memory of the eviction notice still burned in my palm, a stark reminder that the world we had built felt as fragile as paper in a storm. He opened the doors, and we stepped into the grand auditorium. The space stretched wide, rows of plush seats rising in gentle tiers, toward a stage that held a polished mahogany podium, draped with a deep blue banner bearing the company's insignia. The scent of fresh flowers, lilies and roses, mingled with the faint aroma of old paper from the program stacked on each seat. A soft murmur filled the room as guests settled. The rustle of programs, the occasional laugh, the low hum of anticipation. I slipped into the seat beside Richard, feeling the cushion give slightly under my weight, the fabric soft, yet firm against my thighs. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "Thank you for coming." I managed a nod, my throat tight, and let my gaze drift to the stage where a young man in a dark suit stood near the wings, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of nerves and quiet determination. The lights dimmed slightly, and a hush fell over the crowd. Richard stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the stage wood, each step deliberate. He took a breath, lifted his chin, and began to speak. His voice filled the hall, clear and resonant, carrying the weight of years. "For 60 years we have built more than a company. We have built a community of men and women who trust the sea and trust each other." He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes sweeping over the audience. We have weathered storms, celebrated calm waters, and always remembered that the true measure of our success lies in the safety and dignity of those who work upon the waves. I could feel the vibration of his voice in the floorboards, a low thrum that seemed to echo in my own chest. He spoke of early mornings on the docks, the smell of salt and diesel, the camaraderie forged in the cramped quarters of a freighter. His hands moved occasionally, gesturing toward an invisible horizon, his palms open as if offering something precious. As he spoke, I noticed a figure slip quietly into the side aisle, a man slightly older than Richard, with silver threading through his dark hair, a navy blazer that looked slightly too large for his frame. He moved with a cautious grace, his eyes flicking to the podium then back to the crowd, as if measuring the space between himself and the spotlight. Richard's speech faltered for a heartbeat, his gaze catching the stranger's. He smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips, and gestured toward the empty seat beside him. "Please, join me," Richard said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the man without breaking the flow of his address. The stranger hesitated, then walked forward, his steps soft on the carpet, and took the seat. He settled in, his hands resting on his knees, his posture straight but relaxed. I could see the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as he leaned back, the cushions yielding under his weight. Richard resumed, his tone shifting to something more personal. "There are moments when the sea gives us a reminder of why we do what we do." He glanced toward the man beside him, then continued, "Tonight, we honor not just a legacy of business, but a legacy of stewardship." He paused, letting the word hang, and then said, "It is my distinct honor to present the legacy gift to Owen Doyle, whose quiet dedication to the safety of those who sail has echoed the very principles our founder held dear." The applause that followed was warm, genuine, a wave of sound that washed over the auditorium. Owen rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and approached the podium. He took a deep breath, his gaze meeting the crowd, and spoke in a voice that was steady, humble, and tinged with the faintest hint of a coastal accent. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing the value in work that often goes unseen. My father taught me that the sea does not forgive carelessness, and that the truest honor lies in ensuring every person who steps onto a deck returns safely to their shore." He stepped back, his eyes meeting Richard's for a brief moment, before returning to the audience. I felt a prickle behind my eyes, a mixture of pride and unease. The applause swelled again, and I turned my head to see Richard's expression. His smile was tight, his eyes flickering to something beyond the stage. My phone, resting in my purse, buzzed softly against the lining. I slipped my hand inside, feeling the smooth plastic of the case, and pulled it out to see a notification glowing on the screen. The message read, "Hey Dad, just saw the broadcast. Congrats on the award. Sorry I missed it. I'm on the plane to Cabo. We'll call you later." My stomach clenched, not from joy, but from a sudden sharp realization. I remembered the email I had glimpsed earlier that morning on Richard's laptop, a frantic exchange between Benjamin and a private investor, the words, "Guaranteed by legacy gift," blinking in bright red across the screen. I had dismissed it as a misread, a trick of the light, but now the pieces clicked together with a sickening precision. I looked over at Richard, his jaw clenched, his hands resting on the edge of the podium as if bracing himself against an unseen force. He did not notice my stare, his attention fixed on Owen as the younger man returned to his seat. The applause began to fade, the hum of conversation rising again as guests turned to speak with their neighbors. I slipped my phone back into my purse, the cool metal of the device pressing against my palm, and leaned closer to Richard. His shoulder was tense under my fingertips, the fabric of his jacket slightly wrinkled where I gripped it. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid that the words might shatter the fragile calm around us. He turned his head, his eyes meeting mine, and for a heartbeat, I saw something raw flicker behind his usual composure. Fatigue, maybe, or a flicker of fear. He forced a thin, strained smile and said, "I'm fine, Eleanor. Just proud of Owen." His voice lacked its usual steadiness, its edges roughened by something he could not name. A murmur rose from the crowd as the lights brightened, signaling the end of the formal ceremony. People began to rise, gathering their coats, chatting about the award, about the sea, about the future. Richard stood, offering his hand to Owen, who shook it firmly, his grip strong and sure. "Thank you for coming," Richard said, his voice regaining some of its steadiness. Owen nodded, his smile genuine, and replied, "Thank you for the honor." They exchanged a few more words, the kind of polite pleasantries that masked the undercurrents I could sense pulling at the room's edges. I watched as Owen drifted toward a group of younger colleagues, his laughter light, his manner unguarded. Richard lingered a moment longer, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces before he turned and accompanied me down the aisle. We moved through the throng, the buzz of conversation swelling around us like a tide. I could hear snippets of talk, some praising the award, others speculating about the recipient's background, a few murmuring about the noticeable absence of the founder's son. My thoughts drifted back to the email, to the words that had tied Benjamin's fate to a promise he could not keep. I felt the weight of the secret pressing against my ribs, a quiet pressure that threatened to break the surface. As we neared the exit, Richard stopped abruptly, his hand reaching out to steady himself against a marble column. His breath came out in a short, sharp exhale, and he turned to face me, his eyes searching mine for something I could not name. "Eleanor," he began, his voice so low only I could hear, "there is something I need to tell you." I braced myself, my heart pounding against my chest like a trapped bird, waiting for the storm that was about to break. The doors loomed ahead, their bronze surfaces gleaming under the soft light. And beyond them the street waited, wet and indifferent, ready to receive whatever came next. My phone buzzed once more against my palm, a soft vibration that seemed to echo in the sudden hush that had fallen between us. I looked down at the screen, the message glowing bright. "We need to talk. Now." The words were simple, but the implication was a crack in the foundation of everything we had built, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my veins, that the night was only just beginning. "It's a message. It says we need to talk now." I held the phone up so Richard could see the screen, the bright words cutting through the low murmur of the crowd still drifting toward the exits. His brows drew together, the lines deepening at the bridge of his nose. He did not reach for the device. His gaze stayed fixed on the words, as if they might change if he stared long enough. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear over the distant clink of glasses and the shuffle of shoes on marble. "It says we need to talk now," I repeated, feeling the cool metal of the phone press against my palm. I slipped it back into my purse, the flap snapping shut with a soft sound that seemed too loud in the sudden hush between us. Richard exhaled through his nose, a short breath that barely moved the strands of silver at his temples. He turned his head toward the marble column where he had steadied himself moments before, his palm flat against the cool stone. The column bore a faint scratch near its base, a reminder of countless hands that had gripped it during celebrations and farewells alike. "I need to tell you something," he began, his tone measured, each syllable deliberate. "Before we leave this building, there is a matter I cannot ignore." I waited, my hands resting lightly on the fabric of my purse strap, feeling the slight give of the material under my fingers. The air around us smelled of polished wood and faint perfume from a departing guest, a scent that seemed at odds with the weight settling in his words. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for a sign that I was ready. "Benjamin has been trying to reach me since the ceremony ended." He paused, letting the words settle. "His calls have come in waves, 11 missed in the last 20 minutes alone. Each time I glanced at the screen, I saw his name flashing, urgent and insistent. I felt a flicker of surprise. Not as a sudden rush, but as a quiet shift in my posture. My shoulders loosening just a fraction. As I processed the information, I did not speak. Instead, I gave a small nod, encouraging him to continue. "The messages are not just concern," he continued, his jaw tightening slightly. He left a voicemail that sounded angry. He accused me of betrayal, said I had stolen what was rightfully his. He swallowed, the movement visible in the curve of his throat. He claimed he had already spoken to Chloe, that she agreed with him, and he would not accept tonight's decision. I remembered the text I had just seen, the blunt demand for a conversation now. I wondered if that message was from Benjamin as well, or if someone else had reached out in the brief silence between his phone buzz that had interrupted our walk. "What did he say in the voicemail?" I asked, keeping my tone even, my words spaced to avoid sounding rushed. He lifted his hand, gesturing toward the phone still resting in my purse. He said he would not let this stand, that he would fight for what he believes is his. He mentioned something about a promise, about a future he had already planned. Richard's voice dropped further, as if sharing a secret that might be overheard by passing staff. He also said he had taken steps to secure funds, using the company's name as a guarantee. A cold sensation traced my spine, not the sharp sting of fear, but a steady awareness that something serious had shifted beneath the surface of our evening. I inhaled slowly, feeling the air fill my lungs, the scent of lavender from a nearby bouquet mixing with the underlying note of polished stone. "Why would he need funds?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, the words forming naturally from the need to understand. Richard's gaze drifted to the exit doors, where a stream of guests flowed out into the night, their laughter and chatter fading as they moved toward the parking lot. He told me he had borrowed money from an outside investor, using forged documents that bore our company's seal and his signature. He informed the investor the loan would be repaid with the legacy gift, the $800,000 award we just gave Owen. He shook his head slightly, the motion almost imperceptible. He believed the award was his by right, and he acted on that belief before the official announcement. I felt a surge of disbelief, not as a loud outcry, but as a tightening in my chest, a physical reaction that made my fingers press lightly against the strap of my purse. I remembered the email I had seen weeks prior, the one that hinted at Benjamin's excitement about an upcoming inheritance. The way he had spoken of plans for a coastal retreat with Chloe. The pieces now clicked into place, not with a dramatic flash, but with a quiet, inevitable logic. "What does the investor want now?" I asked, my tone steady, my focus on gathering facts rather than letting imagination run wild. "He wants repayment," Richard said, his voice firm. "He has called the investor's representative twice today, each time met with silence, or a terse reply that the loan is due immediately. The investor threatened to involve legal counsel if we do not step in." I pictured Benjamin's face, the flush of anger, the clenched jaw I had seen during family gatherings, when he felt overlooked. I recalled the way he had straightened his tie before the ceremony, the careful way he had adjusted his cufflinks, a ritual he performed when preparing for something important. Now those same gestures seemed tinged with desperation. "Do you think he will follow through with legal action?" I inquired, my mind already turning over possibilities. My attention split between the present conversation and the lingering echo of the ceremony's applause. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not with accusation, but with consideration. "He is capable of it. Benjamin has always been precise when it comes to contracts and numbers. However, he may not realize the gravity of forging documents. He may see it as a temporary solution, a bridge to what he believes is owed." I felt a resolve settle in me, quiet but firm. I could not allow a mistake born of misunderstanding to jeopardize the integrity of the company Richard had built over 4 decades. Nor could I ignore the potential harm to Benjamin himself if he continued down this path. "What do you propose we do?" I asked, my voice clear, the words forming without hesitation. He turned fully toward me, his shoulders squaring as he gathered his thoughts. "First, we need to verify the documents he used. Our legal team can examine the paperwork for signs of forgery. Second, we must speak with Benjamin directly, not through messages or intermediaries, to hear his side and explain the consequences of his actions. Third, if the loan is legitimate, we will need to decide whether we can assist him in repaying it without compromising the company's standing." I nodded, feeling the weight of his plan settle onto my shoulders like a steady load. I reached out, my hand brushing his forearm briefly, the fabric of his jacket warm under my fingertips. The contact was brief, a silent acknowledgement that we faced this together. "Are you ready to go to his office?" I asked, my tone hopeful yet grounded. He glanced at his watch, the small hand pointing just past 9. "Yes. Let's go before the night grows later." He placed his hand on the small of my back, a gentle pressure that guided me toward the exit. As we stepped through the bronze doors, the cool night air greeted us, carrying the faint scent of rain on hot pavement. The streetlights cast pools of amber on the wet sidewalk, reflecting the glow of passing cars. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, and the soft murmur of conversations from nearby cafes. Richard walked beside me, his steps measured, his gaze occasionally flicking to the buildings lining the street. I kept my eyes ahead, noting the way the rain had left a glossy sheen on the road, the way it caught the light and turned each puddle into a tiny mirror. We had not gone far when Richard's phone vibrated against his thigh, a soft buzz that broke the quiet of our walk. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from concentration to something tighter, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It's Benjamin again," he said, his voice low, the words barely audible over the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. "He says he is waiting for us at the main entrance of the building, that he wants to talk face to face." I felt a prickle of anticipation, not the flutter of nervous excitement, but a steady readiness to confront whatever lay ahead. I glanced at Richard, seeing the resolve set in his jaw, the way his shoulders held firm despite the tension evident in his voice. "We will go," I replied, my tone calm, my words deliberate. "We will hear him out." He nodded, and we changed direction, turning back toward the building we had just left. The doors loomed ahead, their bronze surfaces gleaming under the streetlights, ready to receive whatever came next. As we approached, the sound of footsteps echoed from within the marble foyer, a steady rhythm that suggested someone was already pacing near the entrance. I could see a silhouette through the glass doors, a figure tall and broad, shoulders hunched, as if bearing an invisible weight. Richard pushed the door open, the hinges sighing softly, and we stepped inside. The foyer was cool, the air conditioning humming softly against the backdrop of distant traffic. Benjamin stood near the information desk, his back to us, his hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white from the pressure. He turned as we entered, his face illuminated by the soft overhead light. His eyes were red-rimmed, his cheeks flushed, and his mouth set in a firm line. He did not smile. Instead, he held our gaze, his expression a mixture of defiance and pleading. "Benjamin," Richard began, his voice steady, his tone devoid of accusation but firm in its intent. "We need to talk about what happened tonight." Benjamin swallowed, his throat working visibly. He looked from Richard to me, his gaze lingering a moment longer on me before returning to his father. I didn't expect this," he said, his voice rough, the words forced out as if each syllable required effort. I thought it was mine." I watched his hands tremble slightly, not from age, but from the strain of holding back emotion. I saw the way his eyes darted to the side, toward the hallway that led to the offices, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. Richard took a step forward, his movement deliberate, his posture open yet steady. "Let's discuss what you did and what we can do to fix it," he said, inviting conversation rather than demanding confession. Benjamin's shoulders slumped, just a fraction, the tension in his frame easing ever so slightly. He inhaled deeply, the breath shuddering as it left his lungs. And then he spoke, his voice low but clear enough for us to hear in the quiet foyer. "I admit I turned to a private lender," he confessed, falsifying documents and using the company's name as a guarantee. "I believed the legacy gift would cover the debt, convinced it was my due." The confession hung in the air, not as a dramatic explosion but as a stark, simple statement that seemed to settle over us, like a thin layer of dust, on a surface long untouched. I felt no surge of anger, only a sober acknowledgement of the facts laid bare before us. Richard's eyes softened just a touch, not with forgiveness, but with a recognition of the gravity of the situation. He placed a hand lightly on Benjamin's forearm, the contact brief but firm. "We will handle this together," he said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "But we must start by being honest about every step we took." Benjamin nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, his jaw working as he struggled to find the right words. The night stretched ahead, uncertain yet charged with the possibility of resolution. And we stood together in the quiet foyer, ready to face whatever came next. I gripped the phone, my thumb hovering over the screen as Benjamin's words flashed across it. The living room lights cast a soft glow over the sofa where Richard sat, his eyebrows knit in a frown I had seen only a handful of times in our marriage. I read the message again, each syllable striking like a quiet bell. "Dad, I just saw on TV. How could it be Owen? There must be fraud. I will call you to clarify. You see that?" I asked, my voice low but steady, trying not to let the tremor in my throat show. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He took the phone from my hand, his fingers brushing mine briefly before he scanned the text. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping at the corner of his mouth. "He thinks we manipulated the vote," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I watched him, noting the way his shoulders seemed to pull inward, as if bracing for a blow. "He's angry," I said, choosing the word carefully. "He feels cheated." Richard exhaled slowly, the breath audible in the quiet room. "He always felt entitled to that gift," he replied. "I never promised him anything, but he assumed it was his by birthright." I swallowed, the memory of Benjamin's confident smile at last year's family picnic surfacing. He had stood by the grill, flipping burgers with a flourish, telling anyone who would listen that he would one day run Prescott Marine Logistics. Back then, his certainty had seemed like youthful enthusiasm, not a claim stitched into his identity. Richard set the phone down on the coffee table, the screen still glowing with Benjamin's message. "We need to talk to him," he said. "Now, before he does something rash." I nodded, my mind already racing through the possible scenarios. If he had already contacted the investor, if he had moved money, if he had forged documents, each possibility felt like a stone dropping into a dark well. We rose from the sofa together, the floorboards creaking under our weight. Richard led the way down the hall toward his study, the oak door standing ajar as if waiting for us. Inside, the room smelled of leather and old paper, a faint hint of cedar from the desk organizer. Benjamin's laptop lay open on the rug beside the desk, its screen dark. I hesitated at the threshold, feeling the weight of the moment press against my chest. Richard stepped inside, his hand resting on the back of the chair. He pulled out the seat and gestured for me to sit. "Benjamin's going to call soon," Richard said, his voice even. "We should be ready." I sat, crossing my ankles, and placed my hands flat on my knees. The leather of the chair creaked softly as I shifted. Outside, a car passed on the street, its tires humming against the asphalt. The phone on Richard's desk buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen, then looked at me with a question in his eyes. I gave a small nod, and he answered. "Benjamin?" Richard's tone was calm, devoid of accusation. A pause stretched. Then Benjamin's voice came through the speaker, sharp and edged with frustration. Dad, I just saw the announcement. Owen Doyle? You know I expected that gift. Something's off. Richard's eyes flicked to mine, then back to the desk. Benjamin, the decision was made by an independent committee. They reviewed every nominee's contributions. Benjamin laughed, a harsh sound that seemed to bounce off the walls. Committee? You think I don't know how those things work? You pulled strings. You always do. I felt a flash of heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my expression neutral. We didn't pull anything, I said, my voice firm. The process was transparent. Benjamin's breath hitched on the other end. Transparent? Then why am I not up there? Why am I watching some stranger get handed a check that should have been mine? Richard leaned forward, his forearms resting on his desk. Because the committee looked at actual impact, not at expectations. Owen Doyle developed a rescue location system that has already saved lives. He gave away royalties to support workers. That's what they rewarded. A strained silence followed. I could hear Benjamin's breathing, shallow and rapid. You're saying I didn't do enough? He asked, his voice dropping. Richard's tone softened just a fraction. I'm saying the award recognizes what you've actually done, not what you think you deserve. Benjamin snorted. You always side with the outsider. Mom would have never let this happen. The mention of my mother-in-law, who had passed years ago, tugged at a memory I tried to keep buried. I felt a pang, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the present. Benjamin, I said, my voice steady. If you have concerns, we can discuss them. But accusations of fraud won't help anyone. His laugh returned. Bitter this time. Fraud? You think I'm stupid enough to lie about that? I saw the numbers, Mom. The money's already gone. My stomach tightened. Gone. The words struck like a physical blow. I glanced at Richard, whose face had hardened into a mask of resolve. What do you mean the money's gone? Richard asked, his voice low but urgent. Benjamin hesitated, then sighed. The sound of paper rustling came through the speaker. I took a loan against the company's name, he explained. His voice strained. I fabricated the necessary paperwork, anticipating the legacy gift would service the repayment. I felt it was my rightful inheritance. The confession hung in the air, stark and simple. I felt no surge of anger, only a cold acknowledgement of the facts laid bare before us. Richard's eyes narrowed, not with fury, but with a gravity that seemed to settle over the room like dust on an untouched surface. He placed a hand lightly on the desk, his fingers tapping once, twice. We will face this as one, he said, his voice leaving no space for uncertainty. But we need to begin by telling the truth about each step we took. Benjamin's shoulders drooped a little, the tension in his body easing just a bit. He inhaled deeply, the breath shuddering as it left his lungs. And then he spoke, his voice low, but clear enough for us to hear in the quiet study. I didn't know it would blow up like this. I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed. I watched Richard's jaw work as he struggled to find the right words. The night stretched ahead, uncertain, yet charged with the possibility of resolution. And we stood together in the quiet study, ready to face whatever came next. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards as we stood in the foyer, the sound mixing with the faint ticking of the hallway clock. Richard's hand remained on the desk, his fingers still tapping a quiet rhythm. I felt a chill slip up my spine, not from the air, but from the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Richard said, Benjamin, you need to understand what you've done. His voice was low but steady, eyes fixed on the speaker, as if willing the truth to settle. Benjamin's voice came through the speaker, thin and strained. I know I messed up. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. I never meant to hurt the company or you. I stepped closer to the desk, the wood cool under my fingertips. You forged documents, I said, keeping my tone even. You used the company's name to get money you weren't entitled to. That's not a mistake. It's fraud. A faint crackle came from the speaker, like static catching on a word. I didn't think it would blow up like this, Benjamin replied. I saw the numbers. I saw the gift coming. And I thought I could bridge the gap. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. I thought I deserved it. Richard lifted his hand, palm flat on the surface, and pressed down gently. Deserve is not the same as earn, he said. You took a shortcut that hurts everyone who works here. I glanced at the portrait on the wall, the stern face of Patrick Doyle watching over the room. His eyes seemed to follow us, silent and judging. Benjamin let out a humorless laugh. You always side with the outsider. Mom would never have let this happen. The mention of my mother-in-law, who had passed years ago, tugged at a memory I tried to keep buried. I swallowed, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, but kept my face steady. If you have concerns, we can talk about them, I said. Accusations won't fix anything. His laughter turned bitter. You think I'm stupid enough to lie about that? I saw the money leave the account. It's already gone. Richard's eyes narrowed, not with fury, but with a gravity that settled over the room like dust on an untouched surface. He laid his hand lightly on the desk, his fingers tapping, then tapping again. We will handle this together, he said. But we must start by being honest about every step we took. Benjamin's shoulders slumped just a fraction, the tension in his frame easing ever so slightly. He inhaled deeply, the breath shuddering as it left his lungs. Then he spoke, his voice low but clear enough for us to hear. In the quiet study, I didn't think it would blow up like this. I believed I could return it before anyone became aware. I watched Richard's jaw work as he searched for the right words. The night lay ahead, unsure but filled with the chance of resolution, and we stood together in the quiet lobby, prepared to meet whatever followed. A soft click echoed from the hallway as the outer door swung open, letting in a rush of night air, scented with rain on stone. I turned my head, expecting to see a servant or a late-night courier, but the hallway lay empty, save for the sway of the chandelier casting shifting shadows on the marble floor. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard frowned, his gaze shifting to the door. It sounded like the latch, he replied, stepping toward the entrance. Maybe the wind caught it. Benjamin's voice crackled through the speaker again, sharper now. Dad, I need to talk. Alone. He sounded urgent, as if the words were being forced out. I exchanged a glance with Richard, a silent question passing between us. He nodded, motioning for me to stay where I was while he moved to the door. I remained rooted, feeling the cool marble seep through the soles of my shoes. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen downstairs thrummed steadily, a reminder that life went on even as our world tilted. Richard opened the door, the heavy wood groaning on its hinges. A gust of wind pushed past him, rattling the panes of the leaded glass. He stepped outside, closing the door softly behind him. The line clicked, and Benjamin's voice came through, strained and urgent. I need to tell you something I haven't said yet. He paused, as if gathering courage. My borrowing wasn't limited to the private investor. I also withdrew funds from the company's emergency reserve, using falsified transfer records, under the assumption the award would replenish it all. My stomach tightened, the sensation like a stone dropping into a deep well. I could feel the blood rush to my cheeks, heat spreading despite the cool air. Richard's voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. You took more than you admitted. He sounded not angry but resigned, as if a weight had settled on his shoulders. Benjamin swallowed hard, the sound audible, even through the speaker. I was scared. I thought if I could get the gift, I could fix everything before anyone noticed. I was wrong. A sudden crash reverberated from the hallway. A picture frame had fallen from the wall, its glass shattering across the marble. I jumped, my heart pounding in my ears. Richard swore under his breath, his hand flying to his mouth. Stay inside, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll check what happened." He stepped back into the hall, leaving me alone with the speaker and the echo of Benjamin's confession. The silence that followed felt thick, each second stretched thin. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, matching the frantic rhythm of my thoughts. Then, through the speaker, Benjamin's voice came again, quieter now, almost a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to drag you into this." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the words settle like dust on my shoulders. When I opened them, the hallway light flickered, casting a brief strobe across the floor before settling into a steady glow. A soft chime sounded from the study clock, marking the passage of another minute. I realized I had been holding my breath. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension ease just a fraction, and turned my gaze back to the closed door where Richard had disappeared. A thought struck me, sharp and sudden. What else had he hidden that we didn't yet know? The question lingered, unsaid but palpable, as I waited for his return. The door opened after what felt like an eternity, and Richard stepped back inside, his expression grim. He closed the door gently, the latch clicking into place. "It was just the wind," he said, wiping his palm on his trousers. The latch gave way. I nodded, my throat dry. "Did you hear him?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He sighed, running a hand over his forehead. "Every word. Indeed. He confessed to diverting funds from the emergency reserves in addition to the external loan." I felt a wave of nausea rise, bitter and sharp. "How much?" I whispered. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Enough to jeopardize everything if it comes out." I pressed my palm against the cool wall, trying to steady myself. "We need to decide what to do now." He looked at me, his gaze weary, but resolute. "We will face this together. No more secrets. No more shortcuts." A distant siren wailed down the street, its wail rising and falling like a mournful song. The sound seemed to pull the night tighter around the house, reminding us that the world beyond these walls kept moving regardless of our turmoil. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling the vibrations travel up my spine. "What about Benjamin?" I asked, my voice trembling just enough to betray my fear. "He will have to answer for his actions," Richard said. "But we will not abandon him completely. He needs to understand the cost of his choices." I nodded, the resolve hardening inside me like clay left to dry. The house settled around us, the old timbers creaking softly as if exhaling after a long-held breath. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, a short, sharp sound that faded into the night. I turned to face Richard fully, meeting his eyes. "We will do what is right," I said. "For the company, for Patrick's memory, for the people who depend on us." He reached out, squeezing my hand briefly before letting go. "Then let's begin." The hallway light flickered once more, then steadied, casting a steady glow over the marble floor as we prepared to step forward into the uncertain night. Uncharted hours ahead. The rain had just stopped when I stepped onto the porch of Owen's workshop, the scent of wet pine filling my lungs. The wooden doors stood ajar, revealing a space filled with coils of rope, spools of cable, and a half-assembled device that looked like a compass, fused with a screen. I knocked lightly, and the sound was swallowed by the hum of a fan, tucked in the corner. Owen appeared from behind a workbench, his hands still smudged with oil. He wiped them on a rag and gave me a small nod. "Mr. Prescott, thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and steady, each word measured. "Please, come inside." I stepped inside, the air warm with the smell of metal and oil. A small table stood near the window, covered with sketches and a notebook filled with neat handwriting. Owen gestured to a chair opposite him and sat down himself, his posture straight but relaxed. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I wanted to understand something about the legacy gift that has been weighing on me since the ceremony. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. Of course, Mr. Prescott. I will share what I can. His tone was calm. The words "thank you" and "actually" appearing naturally as he spoke. I took a breath and began. When I stepped onto the stage that day, I expected to see my son Benjamin receive the award. Instead, I saw you standing beside me, and later heard your name called as the recipient. It left me with many questions, not just about the decision, but about the meaning behind the award. Owen listened without interruption, his gaze steady. He nodded once before responding. The legacy gift was never meant to be a simple inheritance passed from father to son. It was created by a group that includes the union, the board, and a fund established in my father's memory. Its purpose is to honor those who have made a real difference in the safety and well-being of those who work on the water. I felt a faint tightening in my chest. My name was never on the list of candidates for the final vote, was it? He shook his head slowly. You recused yourself from the vote, Mr. Prescott. You told the committee that because you had a personal connection to both nominees, you could not participate in the decision. That request was honored, and the vote proceeded without your involvement. I let his words settle. The memory of that day returned. The weight of the microphone in my hand. The applause that felt hollow. I did step back, yes. I thought it was the right thing to do, to avoid any appearance of favoritism. I did not realize how much that would leave me in the dark about the process. Owen's expression softened. Your father and my father worked side by side for many years. They built this company on trust and on the belief that safety should never be compromised for profit. When my father passed, he left behind not just a family, but a vision that the industry could be safer if we listened to those who face the dangers every day. He reached for a notebook and flipped it open, showing a page filled with diagrams and notes. This is the early sketch of the rescue locator we developed. It began as a simple idea, a device that could pinpoint a person's location underwater within seconds, even in rough seas. I worked on it in my spare time, using spare parts from old radios and donated sonar units. I leaned forward to see the drawings. Lines crossed and converged, each marked with small notes in his precise hand. You gave away much of your own royalties to fund this? I asked, my voice quieter than before. He nodded. I transferred the majority of the royalties to the fund that oversees the legacy gift. The goal was to make sure the technology could be used by anyone who needed it, not just those who could afford it. My father always said that a life saved is worth more than any profit. A quiet moment passed between us. The only sound the faint whir of the fan and the distant cry of a gull outside. I thought of Benjamin, of his eagerness to claim what he believed was his by right, and of the stark contrast with Owen's quiet dedication. Did you ever feel that your work was overlooked? I asked, choosing my words with care. He smiled faintly. There were times when I wondered if anyone would notice, but I kept returning to the reason I started. My father's belief that no one should have to choose between a paycheck and their safety. When the committee reviewed the nominations, they looked at the impact, not the name attached to it. I felt a pang of regret, not for Owen, but for the path my son had chosen. Benjamin spoke to me before the ceremony. He said he was certain he would receive the gift. He spoke of it as if it were already his. Owen's gaze turned thoughtful. He may have believed that because he heard promises that were not based on the fund's rules. The legacy gift does not guarantee a payout to any individual, no matter their relation to the founder. It recognizes contribution, not entitlement. I let out a slow breath. I have been trying to understand where his certainty came from. He spoke of a conversation with the board, of a confirmation that he would be chosen. Often, Owen's eyes drifted to the window as if searching for something beyond the glass. I have heard rumors of such conversations, but I have never seen any official note or email to support them. The committee's deliberations are recorded, and the minutes show a unanimous decision for me. with 12 votes in favor and 3 abstentions. No mention of your son's name is a certainty. I felt a knot loosen in my chest, replaced by a dull ache. If I may ask, what kept you going when the work seemed endless and the recognition slow? He looked down at his hands, then back at me. My father used to say that the sea does not reward those who shout the loudest, but those who listen to its rhythm. I kept that thought close. Every late night, every failed prototype, I remembered the faces of the workers who relied on us to keep them safe. That kept me moving forward. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle like a stone in my palm. Your father's words sound like something Patrick would have said. Owen's smile grew a fraction wider. Patrick was my father's closest friend. They shared many hours on the docks, talking about ways to improve lifeboat drills and communication during storms. When Patrick passed, he left a letter for me that spoke of hope, that someone would carry forward the concern he held for those who ventured out to sea. I felt a sudden urge to see that letter, to touch the paper that had carried such a promise. May I see it? He rose and walked to a small cabinet, pulling out a folded piece of paper, sealed with a wax emblem. He placed it gently in my hands. The wax bore the insignia of a ship's wheel, intertwined with an anchor. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was familiar, strong yet caring. The ink slightly faded but still legible. My dear Owen, it began. If you are reading this, then you have taken the first step toward understanding that the sea does not belong to those who claim it, but to those who respect it. Teach others to read its signs, to honor its power, and to never forget that every life aboard a vessel is a promise we must keep. I looked up, eyes meeting Owen's. He wrote this before he passed? Owen nodded. Yes, shortly before his last voyage. He asked me to keep it close, to remind myself why we do what we do. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to him. Thank you for sharing this with me, Owen. It gives me a clearer picture of why the legacy gift exists and why it landed where it did. He stood, gesturing toward the door. If you ever wish to see the device in action or to meet the crew who tests it, my door is always open. The work continues, and there is always room for those who want to learn. I rose as well, feeling a shift inside me, a mixture of sorrow for my son's misguided certainty and respect for the quiet determination Owen displayed. I will consider that, I said, my voice steady, and I will strive to honor the true spirit of the award, not just the name attached to it. He extended his hand, and I shook it firmly. Thank you, Mr. Prescott, he said. Thank you for listening. As I stepped back onto the porch, the rain had left the ground glistening, each droplet reflecting the weak light of the late afternoon sun. I paused, looking at the workshop door, and felt a quiet resolve settle within me. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in days, I sensed a direction that was not clouded by expectation or entitlement, but grounded in the simple duty to protect those who rely on the sea. Recap. In this part, Richard Prescott visits Owen Doyle's workshop to understand the origins of the legacy gift. Owen explains that the award comes from a joint fund created by the union, the board, and a memorial fund for his father Patrick Doyle, and that Richard had recused himself from the vote due to personal ties. Owen shares his father's letter about safeguarding sailors and describes his own work on a rescue locator device, noting that he donated most of his royalties to the fund. Richard reflects on his son Benjamin's mistaken certainty about receiving the gift and gains a clearer view of the values the award represents. The part ends with Richard stepping onto the rain-slick porch, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. You know I deserve this, Chloe, Benjamin said, leaning against the desk with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor stood just outside the open office door, the cool air from the hallway brushing her cheeks. She had come to drop off a folder of updated safety reports, intending to slip it onto Richard's desk before the afternoon meeting. Instead, She heard Benjamin's voice, low but confident, drifting out like a promise he believed was already kept. Chloe hovered near the window, her arms crossed, fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the glass. "You keep saying that, but the board hasn't announced anything yet," she replied. Her tone edged with the same mix of hope and doubt that had colored their conversations for weeks. Benjamin pushed off the desk, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "They did. I got the call yesterday. The committee confirmed it. It's just a formality now, waiting for the paperwork to catch up." He glanced at Eleanor, his gaze sliding over her as if she were part of the furniture. "You should see the look on Richard's face when he realizes he's been outplayed." Eleanor felt a flicker of surprise, but she kept her expression neutral, stepping fully into the doorway. The folder in her hands felt suddenly heavy, as if the papers inside carried more than just data. "I didn't hear any call," she said, her voice steady, trying to gauge the truth in his words. "The announcement hasn't been made public." Benjamin's smile widened just a fraction. "That's because they wanted to keep it low-key until the ceremony. You know how Richard likes his surprises." He turned back to Chloe, his posture relaxing. "Anyway, we should start thinking about how we'll spend it. That beach house we looked at in Maine, it's within reach now." Chloe's eyes narrowed. The tapping stopped. "You're counting on money that isn't ours yet," she warned, her voice softer but firm. "What if something changes?" Benjamin laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Nothing will change. I've already talked to the guys at the investment firm. They're ready to move as soon as the funds clear. We'll be set for life." Eleanor watched the exchange, her mind noting the way Benjamin's hands gestured, wide, assured, as if he were already holding the check. She felt the familiar tug of concern, but she forced herself to observe, not to interpret. She noted Chloe's clenched jaw, the way her eyes flicked to the door as if seeking an escape, and Benjamin's relaxed shoulders that spoke of certainty, earned nowhere else but in his own mind. She cleared her throat, breaking the rhythm. "I need to get this to Richard," she said, lifting the folder. He asked for the updated figures before the meeting. Benjamin nodded, his attention already drifting. "Sure thing. Good luck with the numbers." He turned back to Chloe, lowering his voice. "You know, I could use a second opinion on the contractor for the remodel. Someone who won't try to overcharge us." Chloe exhaled, a sound that seemed to release tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I'll look into it. Just be careful, okay?" She glanced at Eleanor, a silent plea passing between them. Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then slipped out of the office, the folder pressed against her chest. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with framed photos of past award ceremonies, ships launching, crews smiling, Richard shaking hands with dignitaries. Each image felt like a reminder of what the company stood for, a legacy built on safety and trust, not on assumptions. She walked toward Richard's office, her steps measured. Halfway there, a soft chime sounded from her pocket. A text message. She pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up with Benjamin's name. Her thumb hovered over the notification, curiosity pulling her to read it despite her better judgment. The message read, "Just got off the call with the board. They love me. Tell Chloe we're celebrating tonight." Below it, a second line appeared moments later. "Don't let Richard find out about the loan yet. We need the gift to cover it." Eleanor's breath caught. The words formed a picture she hadn't expected. A secret loan. A plan to use the anticipated award as collateral. A deliberate concealment from Richard. She felt the folder's weight shift, not from its contents, but from the implication that Benjamin had already moved beyond hope into action. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice low. "Benjamin, we need to talk." There was a pause, then his reply, bright as ever. "Sure, Mom, what's up?" She chose her words carefully, aware that any accusation could push him deeper into his own narrative. "I heard you mentioning a loan. Is everything all right?" His tone shifted. just a hint of defensiveness creeping in. It's just a small bridge loan. Nothing to worry about. The gift will take care of it. Eleanor felt the familiar urge to show, not to tell, the danger she sensed. Instead of stating her fear, she described what she saw. I saw Chloe's face when you talked about the beach house. She looked worried. Benjamin laughed again, a sound that lacked warmth. Chloe worries about everything. She'll be singing a different tune once we have the keys. The conversation ended with a promise to meet later, but Eleanor sensed the gap widening between his words and the reality she was beginning to piece together. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued toward Richard's office, her mind already drafting the questions she would need to ask, the evidence she would need to gather, all while staying within the bounds of what she could observe. She reached Richard's door, knocked lightly, and waited. When he called her in, she entered to find him reviewing a set of blueprints, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up, his eyes softening at the sight of her. "Did you get those numbers?" he asked, gesturing to the stack of papers on his desk. Eleanor placed the folder down, her fingers brushing the edge of the page. "I did. There's a discrepancy in the emergency fund line item, about $60,000 unaccounted for." She chose to speak in concrete terms, letting the numbers speak for themselves. Richard's gaze sharpened. "Show me." She opened the folder to the relevant page, highlighting the column where the figures didn't match. Here, the outgoing transfer was logged as maintenance, but the vendor listed doesn't match any of our approved suppliers. Richard leaned in, his finger tracing the ink. "This doesn't look right." He turned to her, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to trace this. Who approved it?" Eleanor felt the moment settle, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She could not accuse Benjamin outright. She could only present the facts she had uncovered. The request came from the brand development office. It was signed off electronically on the 12th. Richard's jaw tightened. "I'll speak with the IT team. They can pull the logs and see who initiated the transfer." She nodded, feeling a small surge of relief that the process was moving forward, even as the undercurrent of doubt lingered. She stepped back, allowing him space to work, her mind already replaying the conversation she had overheard. The text message, Chloe's worried glance. As Richard began to make calls, Eleanor wandered back toward the hallway, pausing at the window that overlooked the shipyard. The water glistened under the late afternoon sun, boats bobbing gently at their docks. She thought of the letter Owen had shown her, the wax seal bearing a ship's wheel and an anchor, the words about respecting the sea and keeping promises to those who ventured out. She realized that the promise she needed to keep now was not just to the company, but to the truth that lay hidden beneath confident smiles and assured declarations. She turned away from the view, her steps echoing softly on the marble floor, and headed toward the stairwell, determined to follow the trail of evidence wherever it led, while staying firmly within the limits of what she could see, hear, and verify. She paused on the landing, hearing a muffled laugh from below. Benjamin's voice, bright and unbothered, drifting up from the open plan area where a few employees gathered around a coffee machine. She caught a snippet of his conversation. "Yeah, I told them the gift's a sure thing. They're already drafting the paperwork." Eleanor felt the familiar prickle of alarm, but she reminded herself to stay observational. She noted the way his colleagues nodded, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity, none questioning his certainty. She saw Chloe standing near the printer, her shoulders tense, eyes flicking toward the stairwell as if expecting someone. Eleanor continued down, her thoughts forming a quiet resolve. She would not let assumptions guide her actions. She would let the concrete details, altered logs, mismatched vendors, secret messages, lead the way. She reached the bottom floor, turned toward the archives, and began her search, the folder still cradled in her arms, like a shield against the unknown. The hum of the air conditioning blended with the distant clang of shipyard work, a reminder that the world outside kept moving regardless of the tensions within those walls. Eleanor pressed on, her focus sharp, her heart steady, ready to uncover whatever lay beneath the surface of confidence and expectation. I pushed open the heavy archive door, the scent of old paper filling my lungs as I stepped inside. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the dim light, each shelf holding boxes labeled with years and department names. I moved toward the finance section, my fingers brushing the cool metal as I searched for the box marked emergency fund logs. The low hum of the air conditioner mixed with the distant clang of metal from the shipyard outside, a steady reminder that the world kept turning while I searched for truth. I pulled the box labeled 2023-2024 and set it on the nearby table. Inside, folders lay neat, each tab marked with a month. I flipped to the entry for October, the month Benjamin had mentioned the loan. The page showed a transfer of $60,000 labeled as maintenance payment to a vendor called Coastal Supplies. I frowned, recalling that Coastal Supplies had not been on our approved list for over a year. I tapped the page with my fingertip, feeling the slight ridge of the ink under my skin. A soft knock came from the doorway. Richard stood there, his tie slightly loose, his expression a mix of focus and fatigue. "Did you find anything?" he asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I handed him the folder, pointing to the line in question. He leaned over, his brow furrowing as he read. "This doesn't match any approved purchase order," he murmured. He tapped the pen against his chin, then looked up. "We need to see who authorized this. I'll ask IT to pull the login logs for the finance system." He turned and headed toward the door, his steps purposeful. I watched him go, feeling the weight of the folder in my hands, the paper crisp against my palm. I stayed at the table, flipping through more pages, hoping to find a pattern. A few minutes later, Richard returned, accompanied by a young analyst from IT. The analyst carried a laptop, its screen glowing faintly. He pointed to a line of code on the screen, then spoke. The transfer was initiated from a terminal in the brand development office on October 12th. The user ID matches Benjamin Prescott's. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the screen. The analyst closed the laptop and stepped back. Richard turned to me, his voice steady. "We have the proof we needed. Now we need to decide what to do with it." I nodded, feeling a strange steadiness settle in my chest. I could not accuse Benjamin directly. I could only present what I had seen. I left the archive and walked back toward the main office, my shoes clicking on the polished marble. As I passed the open plan area, I heard Benjamin's voice, bright and unbothered, rising above the low hum of conversation. He stood near the coffee machine, gesturing with his cup as he spoke to a few colleagues. "Yeah, I told them the gift's a sure thing. They're already drafting the paperwork." His words floated to me, each syllable landing like a small stone in a still pond. I paused, feeling the familiar prickle of alarm, but I reminded myself to stay observant. I noted how his coworkers nodded, their faces showing respect and curiosity, none questioning his certainty. I saw Chloe near the printer, her shoulders tense, her eyes flicking toward the stairwell as if waiting for someone to appear. I continued on, my thoughts forming a quiet resolve. I would let the concrete details, altered logs, mismatched vendors, secret messages, lead the way, staying within the limits of what I could see, hear, and verify. I reached the stairwell and descended to the lower floor, the folder still cradled in my arm like a shield against the unknown. The air conditioning hum blended with the distant clang of shipyard work, a reminder that life moved on regardless of the tension inside those walls. I pushed open the door to the archives and began my search in earnest, determined to follow the trail wherever it led. Halfway down the aisle, a soft voice called my name. I turned to see Owen standing near a side table, a set of schematics spread before him. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a calm steadiness. "Eleanor, could you take a look at these?" he asked, gesturing to the drawings. I stepped closer, feeling the weight of the folder shift slightly as I moved. He pointed to a diagram of a coastal port, lines radiating from a central point like veins. This is the prototype of the rescue location system we installed at Harbor Point last year, he explained. His voice was steady, his hands moving over the paper with practiced ease. When the port announced a sudden shutdown, 37 workers faced losing their pensions because their employer could not cover the shortfall. He paused, letting the words settle. I watched as he traced a finger along a line that connected the port to a small building inland. I used a portion of the royalties from my patent to fund a temporary subsidy. For 3 months, I covered the gap, ensuring those families received what they were owed. He looked up, his expression sincere. It wasn't much, but it kept them afloat until a new contract was signed. He flipped the page to show a map dotted with red markers. Each red dot marks a location where the system gave an early warning that prevented an accident. In the last 24 months, it has alerted crews to 5 imminent dangers, allowing them to evacuate or secure equipment before harm occurred. He tapped one of the dots, then looked at me. The technology works because it listens to the sea, not just the ships. I felt a quiet admiration rise, not as a fleeting feeling, but as a recognition of concrete action. Owen set the schematics aside and reached for a small box on the table. Inside lay a thin metal band, engraved with a ship's wheel and an anchor. He held it out to me. Patrick gave me this before he passed. He said it was a reminder to stay true to the course, no matter how stormy the water. I took the band, feeling its cool weight against my palm. It was simple, yet it carried a weight of promise. I looked up to see Richard entering the archive doorway, his expression a mix of curiosity and relief. He stopped beside us, his eyes falling on the band, then on the schematics. "Owen, thank you for showing us this," Richard said, his voice appreciative. Owen nodded, his gaze shifting to Richard. "I only want to honor what Patrick believed in, that safety and responsibility belong to everyone who works on the water." Richard turned to me, his voice low. "We need to verify the claims about Benjamin taking credit for this work." He pulled out a printed article from his folder, the headline bold and clear. Prescott Marine Logistics launches groundbreaking safety initiative. Beneath it, a quote attributed to Benjamin Prescott read, "Our team's forward-thinking approach has set a new standard for maritime safety." I stared at the text, the words feeling like a thin veneer over something far less substantial. Richard tapped the article with his finger. This was published last month. Benjamin presented it at the industry conference as his own initiative. He looked at Owen, then back at me. "We have the proof that the technology originated from your work, Owen." Owen's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained calm. "I never sought publicity for it. The goal was to keep people safe, not to claim credit." He glanced at the schematics, then at the band in my hand. "If the technology saves even one life, it has done its job." I felt the moment settle. The weight of the band, the paper, the words, all converging into a clear picture. The truth was not hidden in whispers or rumors. It lay in documents, in diagrams, in the quiet dedication of a man who chose action over a claim. I looked at Richard, seeing the resolve in his eyes. The same resolve that had driven him to build the company from a small dockside office into a respected name. I felt a quiet steadiness settle within me, a sense that we were finally moving toward clarity rather than speculation. A soft chime echoed from the hallway outside, a signal that the security system had logged a new access attempt. Richard glanced toward the door, then back at us. Someone just tried to access the senior leadership folder from an external IP. He frowned, his brow knitting. "I'll have the team trace it." I nodded, my mind already piecing together the fragments, the altered fund log, Benjamin's confident words, Chloe's worried glance, Owen's quiet generosity, and now this unauthorized attempt to reach sensitive files. Each piece fit into a larger picture that was becoming harder to ignore. I stood, the metal band still warm in my hand, and said, Let's see where this leads. Richard placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. Together we stepped back into the corridor, the archive door closing softly behind us. The hum of the air conditioner, a steady backdrop to our determined steps. A low throb pulsed in my temples as the phone rang on the desk, its sharp ring cutting through the low hum of the air conditioner. I lifted the receiver, my fingers curling around the cool plastic, and heard Richard's voice, tight and urgent. Eleanor, Benjamin's on the line. He says a creditor is demanding immediate payment. I swallowed, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that comes when tension tightens like a rope. Put him through, I said, my voice steady despite the flutter in my throat. The line clicked, and Benjamin's tone came through, strained and rapid. Mom, Dad, I need help now. The lender is calling in the loan. They want the full amount today, plus interest and fees. I can't pay it. I heard the edge of panic in his words, the way his breath hitched between sentences. Richard's voice came back, lower and firmer. Benjamin, explain how you got this loan. He swallowed before answering, the sound audible even through the speaker. I borrowed money by misrepresenting company ties and falsifying documents, assuring the lender the legacy gift would be the repayment. It seemed like a viable solution at the time. A cold prickle ran down my spine as I imagined the weight of his deception pressing against his ribs. Richard did not raise his voice, but his words fell like stones. You forged documents and used the company's credit without authorization. That is fraud. Benjamin's reply came fast, his tone edged with desperation. I didn't have a choice. I thought the money was mine. I thought I was owed it. I felt a sudden tightness in my jaw, a reflexive clench that came when I tried to hold back a reaction I could not name. Chloe's voice cut in from the background, sharp and urgent. Benjamin, if they take legal action, we could lose everything. You have to fix this now. I heard the rustle of paper as she shuffled something on the desk, the soft scrape of her nails against the edge. Richard's breath came out slow, measured. I will not use company funds to cover a personal debt you obtained through deceit. The loan agreement is between you and the lender. You must deal with them directly. A silence hung, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hiss of the line. Benjamin's voice dropped, losing its edge, turning almost pleading. Dad, please. If they sue the company, they'll drag your name through the mud. You built this from nothing. You owe me this much. I felt a flicker of something hot behind my ribs, a flash of indignation that I forced down, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Richard's reply was calm, each word placed deliberately. I owe you nothing that compromises the integrity of what we have built. You will face the consequences of your actions. I heard Benjamin inhale sharply, the sound of a man trying to hold back a retort. You don't understand what's at stake. I'll talk to the press. I'll tell them how the company pressured me into this. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, low and threatening. I felt a cold shiver travel down my arms, not from fear but from the stark reality of his words. Richard's voice did not waver. Go ahead and say what you need to say. The truth will surface regardless. The line went dead with a soft click, leaving only the steady hum of the ventilation system. I lowered the receiver, feeling the weight of the plastic against my palm. Richard leaned back in his chair, his shoulders loosening just a fraction as he stared at the ceiling tiles. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered between thought and resolve. I stood, the chair scraping softly against the linoleum, and walked to the window. The city sprawled below, a grid of streets and lights that seemed indifferent to our turmoil. A breeze stirred the curtain, sending a faint rustle through the fabric. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of distant traffic through the pane. The sensation grounded me, pulling my focus away from the rising panic in my chest. A soft knock came at the door. I turned to see Chloe standing there, her eyes wide, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not speak at first, merely inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling in a quick rhythm. "Chloe, I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She moved slowly, her shoes making little sound on the polished floor. I tried to reason with him. She continued, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He won't listen. He thinks if he pushes hard enough you'll give in." I felt a tightening in my throat, a reflexive response to her distress, but I kept my face neutral, my voice even. "We will not compromise the company's integrity to cover a lie." She lifted her head, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What will happen to him? To us?" I glanced toward Richard, who had risen and was now standing near the desk, his hands resting on the wood. "He will have to answer to the lender. We will not shield him from the consequences of his choices." She nodded slowly, a small movement that seemed to carry the weight of resignation. Will you help him find a lawyer?" she asked, her voice steadier now. I considered the request, feeling the familiar pull of familial loyalty tugging at my ribs. Yet I also felt the firm line of principle that had guided me for years. "I will make sure he has access to legal counsel," I said, "but I will not intervene to stop the process." She let out a breath that sounded part relief, part resignation. "Thank you." She turned and left, the door closing with a soft click behind her. I returned to the window, watching a delivery truck rumble past, its engine a low growl that faded into the distance. A sudden buzz from the desk phone made me jump. I lifted the receiver, expecting another call from the lender, but instead heard a voice I recognized as the head of our internal audit team. "Miss Prescott, we've traced the unauthorized access attempt to an external IP address. It originated from a server registered to a shell company linked to Benjamin's personal investments." I felt a sharp intake of breath, my chest tightening as the implication settled. "Did they obtain any files?" I asked, my voice low. "No. The attempt was blocked at the firewall. However, the attempt timestamp matches the time Benjamin was on the phone with the lender." I glanced at Richard, who had moved to stand beside me, his expression unreadable. "We need to lock down those files further," he said, his tone firm. "And we need to inform the board." I nodded, feeling a resolute steadiness settle in my shoulders, like a brace tightening around my spine. The intercom crackled, announcing the arrival of the courier with the Daily Mail. I listened to the wheels of the cart rolling down the hallway, the rhythmic clatter a reminder that the world kept moving regardless of our turmoil. A thought slipped into my mind, unbidden but persistent. If Benjamin could not meet his obligations, what would become of the promise we had made to the workers whose safety Owen now championed? I turned away from the window, my eyes meeting Richard's. "We will see this through," I said, my voice carrying a quiet certainty that surprised even me. He gave a single nod, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the same point beyond the glass. The phone rang again, this time a softer, internal line. I lifted it, hearing the calm voice of our head of security. "All external access attempts have been blocked. We are increasing monitoring on the finance servers." I thanked him, feeling a faint loosening of the tension in my chest as the line went dead. I walked back to my desk, the wooden surface cool under my fingertips. I opened a drawer and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, the crisp edge catching the light. I began to list the steps we needed to take. Notify the board, secure the financial records, prepare a statement for the press, and ensure Benjamin received proper legal representation without compromising the company's stance. As I wrote, the scratching of the pen against paper became a steady rhythm, each stroke a small act of reclaiming order. I paused, feeling the weight of the pen in my hand, and thought of the small metal band Owen had shown me earlier, a simple circle of steel bearing a ship's wheel and an anchor. It reminded me that steadiness came not from avoiding storms but from holding fast to a course despite them. I lifted my gaze to the framed photograph on the wall. A picture of Richard and me on our wedding day, smiles bright, the sea glimmering behind us. The memory felt distant now, yet it anchored me to the reason we had built this life together. A soft chime sounded from the hallway, indicating the elevator had arrived on our floor. I heard footsteps approaching, steady and deliberate. The door opened and Richard stepped in, holding a sealed envelope. "It's the formal notice from the lender," he said, handing it to me. I took it, feeling the weight of the paper, the slight texture of the embossed seal. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter, reading the stark demand for immediate payment, the threat of legal action, the deadline set in bold type. My eyes flicked to the bottom line, a date written out in full, 2024, June the 10th. I looked up at Richard, seeing the resolve etched into his features. The lines around his eyes deepened by concern, but also by steadiness. "We will meet this head-on," I said, my voice low but firm. He placed a hand on my shoulder, the pressure grounding me. "Together," he replied. The hallway lights hummed overhead, a constant low vibration that seemed to echo the resolve settling in my chest. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the private storm we were weathering. Inside, we stood ready to face it, not with secrecy or evasion, but with the quiet strength of those who had built something worth protecting. 3 days later, the morning light filtered through the blinds of our study, casting thin stripes across the desk where the lender's letter lay folded beside a pad of paper. I picked up the envelope, feeling the slight ridge of the embossed seal under my fingertips, and slipped it back into my jacket pocket. Richard stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street below where a delivery truck idled at the curb. He turned when I entered, his expression tight but composed. "Did you manage to reach the board's secretary?" I asked, keeping my voice level. He nodded, pulling a chair out for me. "I spoke with Miss Lowell this morning. She confirmed the vote was recorded and offered to send us a copy of the minutes." I sat, feeling the wooden chair settle beneath me. "Did she say anything about the deliberation?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk. "She said the committee met in private, that each member submitted a written ballot, and that the tally was 13-2 in favor of Owen Doyle. Richard, she also mentioned that you recused yourself from the vote." A quiet breath left me. I had suspected he stepped back, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel more concrete. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Why did you step aside?" He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for a moment before answering. "Because I could not be impartial. Benjamin is my son, and Owen is the son of my oldest friend. If I had voted, the outcome would have been questioned either way." I nodded, feeling the weight of his honesty settle like a stone in my chest. "We need to see those minutes. If there is any chance the process was flawed, we must know now." He stood and walked to the tall cabinet against the far wall, pulling out a set of heavy archival boxes labeled with years in faded ink. I kept everything from the early years, including Patrick's correspondence. Perhaps there is something there that explains why the fund was set up this way. I rose and moved to stand beside him, watching as he lifted the lid of the earliest box. The scent of aged paper and faint cedar rose from within. He lifted a bundle of letters tied with a faded red ribbon, his fingers trembling slightly as he untied the knot. "These are from Patrick," he said, voice softer than before. "He wrote them to me but never sent them. I found them after his passing, tucked behind a false panel in his desk." I reached out and touched the top envelope, feeling the rough texture of the paper. "May I read one?" He handed it to me, and I unfolded the sheet carefully. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words were still legible. "My dear Richard, I have been thinking about the safety of the men who work the docks. Too often we hear of accidents that could have been avoided with better equipment or clearer procedures. I want to set aside a fund that rewards those who go beyond the call of duty, not for publicity but because it is right. I trust you to oversee it, knowing you will keep the workers' interests at heart. If anything ever happens to me, I hope you will continue this work. My son Owen has shown a keen interest in maritime safety. Perhaps one day, he will carry this torch forward. Your friend Patrick. I looked up, eyes meeting Richard's. His jaw was tight, but there was a flicker of something else. Perhaps relief. Perhaps sorrow. He always thought of the crew before himself, I said softly. It makes sense that the fund would be designed to honor that kind of dedication. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the next letter. There are more. Let's see if any mention the board's formation. We worked through the stack together, each letter revealing a piece of Patrick's vision. Some spoke of his fear that profit would eclipse safety. Others spoke of his hope that a neutral body could oversee the award to prevent favoritism. Near the bottom of the box, we found a thin file labeled Independent Committee Formation Notes. Inside were typed minutes from a meeting held 2 years after Patrick's death, detailing the creation of an oversight panel composed of union representatives, a maritime lawyer, a retired Coast Guard officer, and a philanthropist unaffiliated with the company. Richard read aloud a passage that made my breath catch. The committee shall have sole authority to select the recipient of the legacy gift. No executive of Prescott Marine Logistics may participate in the voting process to avoid any appearance of conflict. I felt a surge of relief mixed with sadness. Patrick had anticipated exactly the kind of pressure we were now facing. He had built a safeguard into the very structure of the award. Richard, I said, my voice steady. This means the decision was never yours to make. It was taken out of your hands to protect the integrity of the prize. He closed the folder slowly, his hands resting on the lid. And yet I still feel responsible for the outcome. Benjamin believed he was entitled, and his actions have put us all at risk. I reached across the desk and placed my hand over his. Responsibility does not mean blame. It means we will face what comes with honesty. A soft knock sounded at the door, and James, our head of security, stepped in. He held a sealed envelope marked with the company's logo. Sir, Madam, the board secretary has sent the certified copy of the vote tally as requested, he said, placing it on the desk. I thanked him, and he retreated, closing the door gently behind him. Richard broke the seal and unfolded the pages. The document bore the official seal of the independent committee, the date, and the names of each member with their respective votes. 13 names were marked for Owen Doyle, 2 for Benjamin Prescott. A brief note at the bottom explained that the 2 dissenting votes cited concerns about Benjamin's recent financial dealings, though no proof was offered at that time. I read the names aloud, letting each one settle in the room like a quiet affirmation. 13-2. The consensus is clear. Richard leaned back, his shoulders loosening just a fraction. We have what we needed to move forward. Now we must address the fallout from Benjamin's loan. I stood, feeling the familiar pull of purpose that steadied me in turbulent times. First, we need to make sure the funds meant for the workers are protected. Second, we need to see that Benjamin faces the consequences of his actions without dragging the company down with him. He stood as well, his expression resolute. I will speak with our legal counsel tonight. We will prepare a statement for the press that affirms our commitment to transparency and outlines the steps we are taking to correct this. I walked to the window and looked out at the busy street below. A bicycle messenger weaved between cars. A street vendor called out the day's specials, and life continued indifferent to our private turmoil. Yet inside these walls, something had shifted. We were no longer reacting to a crisis. We were responding with a plan grounded in the very principles Patrick had hoped to uphold. A sudden thought sparked in my mind, sharp and urgent. If the board's records are solid, then what else might we uncover about the funds themselves? Where is the money that was supposed to go to the award, and has any of it been diverted? I turned back to Richard, whose eyes were already narrowing with the same question. We should ask the treasurer to produce a full ledger of the legacy gift account from its inception to the present. He nodded, already moving toward the phone. I'll call him now. As he lifted the receiver, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. Not the frantic panic of earlier days, but a steady resolve that felt like the anchor Patrick had described in his letter. We were not just defending our name, we were honoring a promise made to the men and women who risked their lives on the water, and we would see that promise kept. Recap: Eleanor and Richard obtained the official vote tally from the independent committee, confirming Owen Doyle received 13 votes to Benjamin's 2. They also discover unsent letters from Patrick Doyle revealing his intent to create a safeguarded award overseen by a neutral board, which explains why Richard recused himself. The couple resolves to protect the fund's integrity and to address the fallout from Benjamin's fraudulent loan, planning to request a full ledger of the legacy gift account and to prepare a public statement with legal counsel. James, the head of security, delivers the requested documents. The scene ends with Eleanor and Richard aligning on a course of action grounded in transparency and duty. "Please, give us more time, I beg you," Chloe said, her voice low and urgent, as she leaned across the small table in the investor's dim office. The room smelled of stale coffee and old paper. A single lamp, casting a warm pool over the scattered financial statements. James had warned me earlier about unusual access attempts on the senior finance server, but I had not connected those alerts to Chloe's sudden disappearances from the house. I watched her fingers tap nervously against the worn wood, her eyes flicking gaze fixed on the man opposite her. "Mrs. Prescott, the terms are clear," the investor replied, his tone flat, his hands resting on a thick folder. $600,000 plus accrued interest is due within 48 hours. Any delay invites legal action and a public filing. Chloe swallowed, her throat working as if she were trying to push down a stone. "We are liquidating assets, but the process takes longer than you anticipate. A short extension would allow us to meet the obligation without forcing a sale at a loss." The investor's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Extensions are not part of the agreement. Your husband's company guaranteed repayment through the legacy gift. That guarantee has not materialized, and my confidence wavers." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, though I remained unseen behind the frosted glass of the outer office door. Chloe's shoulders tightened, the fabric of her blouse pulling taut across her back. She glanced toward the door, perhaps sensing a presence, then turned back to the investor with a forced smile. "What if we could secure a bridge loan from another source?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "We could offer additional collateral, perhaps a portion of the emergency reserve." The investor shook his head, his jaw tightening. "The emergency reserve is off limits. It is earmarked for operational safety, not private debt. Any attempt to divert those funds would breach fiduciary duty and trigger immediate investigation." Chloe's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles whitening against the wood. She inhaled deeply, the breath shuddering as she tried to regain composure. "Then what do you propose?" "Bankruptcy would ruin both families, damage the company's reputation, and leave unpaid workers without the safety fund you claim to protect." The investor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I could delay the filing for another week, but only if you provide verifiable proof that the legacy gift will be transferred to my escrow account within that period. Otherwise, I proceed Monday morning." A sharp idea flashed through my thoughts. Urgent and clear. If Chloe could not produce the promised funds, the investor would go public, dragging the Prescott name into scandal. I needed to act, but I could not reveal my knowledge without jeopardizing the ongoing investigation. I slipped away from the door, my steps silent on the plush carpet, and made my way back to the main hallway. James appeared at the intersection, his expression grave. "Madam, the security logs show an external IP attempting to access the legacy gift ledger at 1400 hours today," he reported, his voice even. "The attempt was blocked, but the pattern matches the earlier intrusion tied to Benjamin's venture. I nodded, processing the information. Chloe's meeting with the investor likely explained the timing. I needed to confront her, but I had to do so without alerting the investor or tipping off Benjamin. "Thank you, James," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Please increase monitoring on all finance terminals and alert me immediately if any further attempts occur." He gave a terse affirmation and retreated to his station. I paused outside Chloe's office, listening. Muffled voices drifted through the thick door, higher-pitched, tense. Then a brief silence followed by a soft sigh. I knocked lightly, and the door opened to reveal Chloe, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. She stepped back, allowing me to enter. "Chloe, is everything all right?" I asked, choosing my words carefully to avoid accusation. She forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Just discussing household matters with a consultant. Nothing urgent." I stepped inside, noting the open laptop on her desk, a spreadsheet visible with columns labeled loan, interest, due date. The numbers were spelled out in words, not digits, a habit she had picked up from Richard's old ledgers. My gaze flicked to the clock on the wall. It read 2:15 in the afternoon. "You seem troubled," I continued, choosing observation over assumption. "Your hands are shaking, and your breath is shallow." She laughed nervously, a short sound that held no humor. "It's just the stress of the upcoming anniversary dinner. I want everything perfect for Richard." I let the statement hang, knowing it was false. The anniversary dinner had been postponed indefinitely after the scandal surfaced. I needed more concrete proof before confronting her directly. "May I see the schedule for today's appointments?" I asked. Reaching for the planner on her desk, she hesitated, then slid it toward me. The pages showed a meeting listed at 1300 with J. Harlow, private consultant. No further details. "Who is J. Harlow?" I inquired, keeping my tone neutral. She glanced at the planner, then back at me. "A financial advisor Richard mentioned months ago. He offered to review our personal investments." I felt a flicker of suspicion. Richard had never mentioned such an advisor to me, and the timing coincided with the investor's demand. I needed to verify this claim without alerting Chloe. "Would you mind if I called Richard to confirm?" I asked, my voice gentle. She tensed, her shoulders rising slightly. "Of course, go ahead." I stepped toward the door, pulled out my phone and dialed Richard's number. He answered after a couple of rings, his voice warm but preoccupied. "Richard, it's Eleanor. Chloe just mentioned a meeting with a financial advisor named J. Harlow." "Did you arrange that?" I asked, listening for any hesitation. A pause followed. Then Richard's reply came, low and measured. "Eleanor, I have not spoken with any advisor named J. Harlow recently. Chloe must be mistaken." I ended the call, my heart pounding. Chloe's deception was becoming clearer. I turned to face her, my expression steady. "Chloe, Richard says he has no record of this advisor," I said, choosing my words to convey concern rather than accusation. "Can you explain why you told me otherwise?" Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me. She swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. I wanted to help. Benjamin's situation is dire, and I thought if we could secure additional funds, we could protect the family." She lowered her voice, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I met with the investor today. He demanded repayment within 2 days, or he would file a lawsuit and go to the press. I begged for more time, but he refused, unless we could show proof of the legacy gift transfer." I panicked and lied about the advisor to buy us a day. I felt a wave of disappointment, but also relief that the truth was surfacing without outward confrontation. I needed to keep my composure to gather further evidence and protect the investigation. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice soft. "We must act quickly to resolve this without endangering the company or the workers' fund." She nodded, tears glistening on her cheeks. "I will cooperate fully. I just want to keep my marriage intact." I placed a reassuring hand on her forearm, feeling the tremor beneath her skin. "We will find a way forward. Together." As I left her office, my mind raced with possibilities. The investor's threat loomed, but we now had concrete evidence of Chloe's attempt to manipulate the situation. A lie about a fictitious advisor, a desperate plea for extension, and a willingness to consider diverting protected funds. I needed to inform Richard and James, but first I had to secure the legacy gift ledger to ensure no unauthorized transfers had occurred. I hurried to the finance department, where the head treasurer, Margaret, awaited my arrival. She looked up as I approached, her expression professional. "Madam Eleanor, the ledger shows no unauthorized withdrawals since the last audit," she reported, her voice steady. However, there was a failed login attempt from an external IP at 1400 hours, matching the pattern James described. I thanked her and requested a printed copy of the ledger for the past 12 months, focusing on the legacy gift account. Margaret obliged, handing me a thick stack of paper bound with a cloth tie. I retraced my steps to James's office, where he monitored the security feeds. He glanced up as I entered, his eyes sharp. "James, the ledger is clean. But we have proof of Chloe's deceit regarding the advisor meeting and her encounter with the investor," I said, keeping my tone factual. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "We will place a discreet watch on her communications and monitor any attempts to access company accounts. If she tries to move funds, we will catch it." I felt a resolve settle within me, steadier than the panic of earlier days. The path forward required transparency, swift action, and protection of the very promise Patrick had envisioned, a safety net for those who risked their lives on the water. I returned to my study, the weight of the ledger papers heavy in my arms. Opening the first page, I saw the inaugural deposit recorded in elegant script. "Legacy Gift Fund, established to honor maritime workers' safety and dedication." The subsequent entries showed regular contributions from the company's profits, none earmarked for private debt. An urgent notion struck me suddenly, clear and pressing. If Chloe had considered diverting these funds, what other vulnerabilities might exist in our financial controls? I needed to tighten oversight, not just for the present crisis, but for the long-term integrity of the company. I whispered a promise to myself, one that would guide my actions in the days ahead. We would not only confront the immediate threat but also rebuild the safeguards that had allowed this breach to occur. The safety of the workers and the honor of the Prescott name depended on it. Recap. Eleanor confronts Chloe after discovering her secret meeting with an investor, demanding repayment of Benjamin's fraudulent loan. Chloe admits to lying about a fictitious financial advisor and begging for an extension, revealing her fear of public scandal and her willingness to consider diverting protected funds. Security logs confirm a blocked external attempt to access the legacy gift ledger, matching earlier intrusion patterns. Eleanor secures a clean copy of the ledger, consults with James and Margaret, and resolves to tighten financial oversight while preparing to protectives while supporting Chloe through the crisis. Richard remains unaware of Chloe's deceit. Benjamin's loan issue persists, and Owen's standing as the legitimate legacy gift recipient is reinforced. The immediate threat of investor exposure looms, but the family now possesses concrete evidence to address the situation without further destabilizing the company. Words 112. I slammed the folder onto the desk and stared at the blinking cursor, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound in the quiet office. James leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his expression tight. "The external IP attempt happened again at 1400 hours, he said, voice low. "Same pattern as before, but this time the login failed after 3 tries. I nodded, feeling the weight of the ledger papers in my lap. "Did Margaret confirm there were no unauthorized withdrawals?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. James pushed off the frame and walked over, his shoes silent on the carpet. "She ran a full audit this morning. The legacy gift account shows only the regular quarterly deposits from company profits," he replied. No transfers, no adjustments, nothing out of the ordinary. A faint prickle rose at the base of my skull. And the failed login? I inquired, eyes narrowing slightly. It originated from an address routed through 2 overseas servers, James said. The timestamps matched the window when Chloe left the investor's office yesterday. He paused, glancing at the security monitor on the wall. We flagged it for deeper inspection, but the trail goes cold. After the second hop, I set the folder down gently, the paper rustling softly. We need to see who benefits from making it look like an outside attack, I murmured. More to myself than to him. James frowned. You think someone inside is trying to throw us off? I leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. The timing is too convenient. Chloe admitted she considered diverting protected funds, yet she also claimed she never met with a fictitious advisor. If she wanted to hide her tracks, fabricating an external breach would buy her time. He straightened, jaw tightening. Or it could be a former employee with a grudge. We had that technician, Marcus Lane, fired 6 months ago after the data loss incident. He's been vocal on social media about feeling wronged. A thought sparked, sharp and urgent. Let's pull his file and see if his known aliases match any of the IP nodes, I suggested, standing. James moved to the terminal, fingers flying over the keyboard. I'll cross-reference his old login credentials with the geolocation logs, he said. Voice focused. I walked to the window, watching the late afternoon light slant across the manicured lawn. The scent of freshly cut grass drifted in, mixing with the faint perfume of Eleanor's lavender sachet on the sill. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady the flutter in my chest. Behind me, James let out a low whistle. Interesting, he said. Marcus's personal email shows a login from an IP in Belarus at 13:55, just 5 minutes before our failed attempt. I turned, eyebrows rising. Belarus? That's far from his last known address in Ohio. He's been using a VPN service that routes through Eastern Europe, James explained. It could be him, or it could be someone else using his credentials as a mask. I crossed my arms, mind racing. If it's Marcus, why would he target the legacy gift ledger now? He left before the award was announced. James shrugged. Maybe he heard about the payout through Grapevine and wants to embarrass the company. Or maybe he's being paid to create chaos. A soft knock sounded at the door. Margaret peered in, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Madam Eleanor, I've completed the supplemental report you requested, she said, holding out a stapled packet. I also ran a check on any former employees with access to the financial system after their departure. I took the packet, feeling the weight of the paper. Thank you, Margaret, I said, voice calm. Please keep this between us for now. She nodded, eyes flicking to the security monitor. Of course. I've also noted an unusual pattern in the printer logs. Someone printed a blank page 3 times at 1400 hours on the same day the investor called Chloe. I frowned. A blank page? I asked. Curiosity piqued. It could be a test, Margaret replied. Or a signal. Whoever sent it didn't want any traceable text. James stepped closer, his expression grim. We should run a trace on the printer's network address, see if it matches the external IP. I nodded, resolve hardening. Do it. And pull Marcus's exit interview notes. I want to know exactly what he said about his dismissal. James turned back to the screen, his fingers a blur. Already on it, he murmured. I moved to the bookshelf, running a finger along the spines of old maritime manuals. The familiar scent of leather and salt evoked memories of Richard's early days at the docks. The way he'd talk about tide charts and safety protocols. I inhaled, letting the nostalgia ground me. A sudden thought struck me like a wave. What if the blank page was a distraction? I said aloud. More to the room than to anyone. James looked up, eyes sharp. Explain. If someone wanted us to chase a false lead, they'd leave something obvious but meaningless, I said. The blank page could be a decoy to draw attention away from the real breach. Margaret tilted her head. Or it could be a mistake, I shook my head. In my experience, mistakes rarely look this deliberate. The timing, the repeated prints, the VPN hop, all point to intention. James slammed his palm lightly on the desk, the sound echoing. Then we need to find out who had both the motive and the technical skill to pull this off. I walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the knob. Let's start with Marcus. If he's clean, we'll look inward. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The muted chatter of distant phones and the occasional laugh from the break room reaching my ears. The carpet softened my steps as I headed toward the archives, where the old employee files were kept in locked cabinets. The air grew cooler as I passed the server room. The low hum of machines, a constant reminder of the invisible threads connecting us all. I paused at the archway, glancing at the glass wall that showed the blinking servers like a heartbeat. Inside the archive room, rows of metal cabinets stood silent, each labeled with a year and a department. I ran my fingers over the cool metal of drawer labeled Personnel. 2022. The lock clicked open under my key, and I pulled out the folder for Marcus Lane. His file was thin, mostly performance reviews, and a final exit interview transcript. I flipped to the last page, scanning the typed words. Marcus had written, "I feel the company has turned its back on loyalty. I will find a way to be heard." A chill through me, not from fear, but from the realization that his words could be twisted into a threat. I closed the folder gently, feeling the paper's edge against my thumb. I returned to James's office, where he was staring at a screen filled with traceroute diagrams. "Marcus's old credentials don't match any of the nodes," he said, frustration evident in his tone. "But the VPN service he used is the same one that shows up in the logs." I leaned in, eyes tracing the lines. "So he could have shared his login with someone else before he left." James nodded. "Or someone stole his badge and used it to gain access, then covered their tracks with the VPN." I thought of the security badge readers at the east entrance, the way they logged each swipe. "Let's check the badge logs for the day before his termination. See if anyone used his card after hours." James pulled up another window, his brow furrowed. "Here we go." On the night of March 12th, at 22:10, Marcus's badge was used to enter the finance wing. The log shows a duration of 12 minutes. I felt a prickle at the base of my skull. That's after his shift ended. Who else would have his badge? James pointed at a timestamp just 2 minutes later. The same badge was used again at 22:25 to exit the building. No other swipes in between. I swallowed, mind racing. If Marcus gave his badge to someone, that person would need to know his PIN. James tapped the screen. The PIN attempt log shows 3 failures before success on the first try that night. That suggests the user knew the PIN or observed it being entered. I stood, pacing slowly behind his chair. Who had opportunity to observe him entering his PIN? James's eyes flicked to a name on the roster. Chloe Preston. She often stayed late to review financial reports with Benjamin. She would have seen him type his code at the terminal near the coffee station. A cold certainty settled in my chest. Not because I blamed Chloe outright, but because the pieces aligned too neatly. I turned to James, voice low but firm. "We need to compare the timing of Chloe's movements that night with the badge logs." He opened a second tab, pulling up the building's access log for the executive suite. Chloe's badge shows she left the executive suite at 22:10, entered the finance wing at 22:11, and exited at 22:26. I felt my breath catch. She was there exactly when Marcus's badge was used. James leaned back, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. But why would she do that? She's not a technician. I thought of the investor's demand, the desperation in Chloe's voice when she begged for an extension, the way she'd lied about a fictitious advisor. She might have needed to create a diversion, to make it look like an outside attack so the investigation would stall. James shook his head slowly. It's risky. If caught, she'd face felony charges. I walked to the window again, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Desperation makes people do reckless things, I said quietly. And she's already shown willingness to cross lines to protect Benjamin. A soft chime sounded from James's phone. He glanced at it, then back at me. The investor's lawyer just emailed. They want a response by tomorrow morning or they'll file suit. I turned, my resolve solidifying. Then we have to present what we found. Not accusations, but facts. Let Richard decide the next step. James nodded, standing. I'll compile the badge logs, the VPN traces, and the printer log into a clear packet. I walked to the door, pausing one last time to look at the empty hallway. The scent of cleaning solution lingered in the air, sharp and clean. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the ledger paper still resting on my arm. The words inside a quiet promise to uncover truth, no matter how uncomfortable it became. Recap: Eleanor investigates a recurring external IP attack on the legacy gift ledger with James. They discover the attack timing matches Chloe's movements and a former employee's badge usage. Badge logs show Chloe entered the finance wing using Marcus Lane's credentials the night before his termination, while printer logs reveal a blank page printed at the same moment. VPN traces tie back to the same service Marcus used. Eleanor concludes Chloe may have fabricated the external breach to stall the investigation, though James urges caution. They prepare a factual packet for Richard. Richard remains unaware of Chloe's deceit. Benjamin's loan issue persists. Owen's standing as the legitimate legacy gift recipient is reinforced. The investor's threat looms, but the team now holds concrete evidence pointing to internal manipulation. Words 118. A soft click echoed from the hallway as I stared at the blinking red light on the monitor. The sound pulled my thoughts away from the endless stream of numbers scrolling across the screen. Richard had asked me to stay behind after the meeting with Owen, saying he needed a quiet moment to think. I nodded and stayed, the dim light casting long shadows across the deserted floor. Owen's voice came from the doorway, soft but steady. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, stepping inside with a worn leather satchel in his hand. I turned, noting the faint lines of fatigue etched around his eyes despite his composed smile. Not at all, I replied, gesturing to the chair opposite Richard's desk. Please have a seat. He lowered himself into the seat, the creak of the chair barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his gaze fixed on Owen. You've been quiet about what drove you to build that rescue system, Richard said. I'd like to understand the motivation behind it. Owen inhaled slowly, his fingers tapping the edge of the satchel. My father spent his life watching men and women risk everything on the open water, he began. He came home each night with stories of close calls, of friends lost, because a simple signal failed. I watched him stare at charts late into the night, tracing routes with a pencil that never seemed to stay sharp. He paused, the memory tightening his jaw. I wanted to give those workers something he never had, a reliable way to call for help when the sea turned hostile. A faint smile touched his lips. I spent countless nights in a rented garage, soldering wires, testing signals, in a bathtub filled with salt water. I missed birthdays, missed holidays, missed the chance to just be a son who could relax after work. His voice dropped, a hint of weariness threading through his words. Every prototype felt like a promise to him, and every failure felt like letting him down. Richard's shoulders relaxed a fraction, the tension in his jaw easing. I see the dedication in your hands, he said. I've spent 40 years building this company, trying to keep the waterways safe for those who depend on them. I thought I was doing enough, but watching you work reminds me that true safety comes from sacrifice, not just profit. I felt a shift in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that settled between the three of us. Owen reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, weathered compass. My father gave me this before his last voyage. he said, placing it gently on the desk. He told me to always find true north, no matter how stormy the sea. He looked at Richard, his eyes steady. I hope this can serve as a reminder that the course we set matters more than the speed we travel. Richard reached out, his fingers brushing the cool metal of the compass. Thank you, he murmured. Your father's wisdom lives on in your work. Owen nodded, rising to leave. I'll keep striving to honor that, he said, heading for the door. The soft click of the latch echoed behind him, a sound that felt like a promise sealed. I remained seated, the weight of the conversation settling in my chest. My thoughts drifted to Benjamin, to the way he had laughed over champagne just weeks ago, boasting about the legacy gift, as if it were a birthright. I remembered the evening he had brushed off my concerns, his voice bright with certainty that the award was already his. The contrast felt stark, a chasm between Owen's quiet perseverance and my son's entitled expectation. A soft chime from my computer pulled me back. An email from the Internal Affairs Unit flashed in my inbox. The subject line stark. Investigation update, Benjamin Prescott and Chloe Preston. I hesitated, then opened it, the words appearing line by line. The message detailed the forged documents Benjamin had used to secure the loan, the falsified signatures that mimicked corporate seals, and the email chain where he had promised repayment using the anticipated legacy gift. It traced Chloe's late-night logins, showing her using a colleague's credentials to access the finance wing at the exact moment the unauthorized transfer was initiated. The report concluded that the external breach we had suspected was a fabrication, a smokescreen created to stall the investigation. I read each paragraph slowly, the severity of the accusations settling like a stone in my gut. My fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, the wood biting into my palm. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from anger alone, but from a deep, aching disappointment that settled where pride once lived. A soft knock sounded at the door, breaking the silence. I looked up to see James, our head of security, standing hesitantly. Miss Prescott, he said, his voice low. We've just received a call from the investor's legal team. They've requested an immediate meeting to discuss the outstanding loan. I stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor. Thank you, James, I replied. Please have them sent to the conference room. I'll be there shortly. He nodded and slipped back into the hallway, his footsteps fading into the ambient hum of the building. I took a deep breath, the air feeling cooler than before, and walked toward the door, the weight of the compass still resting in my mind. As I reached the hallway, the overhead lights flickered briefly, casting a brief shadow that stretched across the polished floor. In that instant, I felt a resolve settle over me, steady and unyielding. I would face whatever came next, not as a mother shielding a child, but as a woman committed to the truth that had guided my husband's life's work. I pushed open the door to the conference room, the glass panels reflecting the dim light of the corridor. Inside, the long mahogany table sat empty save for a single folder placed at its center, its tab labeled with the investor's name in bold, dark letters. I paused, hand on the cool metal of the handle, and glanced back down the hallway one last time. The soft click of the latch sounded again, this time from the office behind me, as if the building itself were acknowledging the shift that had begun. I stepped inside, closed the door quietly, and took my seat, ready to confront the facts that lay before us. Recap: Eleanor listens as Richard speaks with Owen about the sacrifices behind Owen's rescue technology, contrasting Owen's dedication with her son Benjamin's entitled attitude. She reads an internal affairs email detailing Benjamin's forged loan documents and Chloe's unauthorized system access, confirming the external breach was a ruse. James informs her that the investor's legal team requests an immediate meeting. Eleanor prepares to face the impending confrontation, steeling herself for the factual showdown ahead. Words. 132. Minutes later, the doors swung open, and a flood of reporters surged into the conference room. Cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. I took my place beside Richard, feeling the weight of every flashbulb like a small hammer on my chest. Owen stood a few steps to our left, his hands clasped loosely at his sides, eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for something solid beneath the polished wood. A murmur rose from the crowd as a young woman with a notebook stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. "Mrs. Prescott, can you confirm that the legacy gift was awarded to Owen Doyle, despite expectations that Benjamin Prescott would receive it?" I felt Richard shift beside me, his jaw tightening before he spoke. "Richard, the award was decided by an independent committee after a thorough review of nominees. Their decision stands." The reporter pressed on, voice edged with curiosity. "Did Mr. Prescott have any influence over the committee's decision, Richard?" "I recused myself from the vote once I learned both nominees were personally connected to me. The process remained impartial." A murmur rippled through the room, and another reporter leaned forward, microphone glinting. "Mr. Prescott, your son Benjamin was noticeably absent from the ceremony. Can you explain his absence?" "Richard. He informed us he was traveling. I learned later that his plans changed." I felt a flicker of something cold in my chest, but I kept my face steady, letting the words settle like dust on a shelf. The next question came from a man with a recorder tucked under his arm. Reporter: "Mrs. Prescott, did you know about the loan your son secured using company documents?" I swallowed, the taste of metal on my tongue. I chose each of my words with careful precision. "Eleanor, I learned of the loan after the ceremony. I was as shocked as anyone to discover the documents had been falsified." The reporter's eyes narrowed, seeking a crack. Reporter: "Did you confront him immediately?" Eleanor: "I spoke with him and with Richard. We agreed to let the internal investigation uncover the facts before making any public statements." A low hum rose from the crowd, like the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I glanced at Owen. His gaze lifted briefly, meeting mine for a heartbeat before returning to the floor. I felt a strange kinship in that moment. Two people bound by loss and by the weight of expectation. The next question came from a woman whose notebook bore the logo of a financial newspaper. Reporter: "Mr. Prescott, the investor claims your son forged signatures to obtain a $600,000 loan, promising repayment with the legacy gift. Is that accurate?" Richard: "The investigation confirms that documents were altered and signatures forged. The loan was obtained under false pretenses." A murmur of assent rippled through the press. The reporter pressed further, voice low. Reporter: "Will the company pursue legal action against your son?" Richard: "We will cooperate fully with any legal process. Our priority is to uphold the integrity of the company and the legacy we have built." I felt the tension in my shoulders ease a fraction, as if a weight had shifted rather than lifted. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Then a younger reporter, notebook clasped tight, leaned forward with a question that felt like a spark. Reporter: "Mr. Prescott, your son has admitted to using the company's name to secure the loan. Does he regret his actions?" Richard: "He has expressed regret for the harm caused. Regret alone does not erase the consequences." I felt a sting behind my eyes, but I blinked it away, focusing on the steady rhythm of my breath. The next question came from a voice I recognized, Chloe's, though she sat in the back, her eyes downcast. Reporter: Chloe's voice, though she did not stand: "Mrs. Preston, did you know about the loan before it was taken?" I felt a surge of frustration, but I kept my voice steady, refusing to let it rise. Eleanor: "I learned of it after the fact. I had no prior knowledge." The reporter's pen scratched across paper, a sound like a tiny storm. I sensed the room shift, the air thickening with anticipation. Then a voice cut through, clear and firm, belonging to the lead investigator from Internal Affairs. "Investigator, we have completed our review. The forged documents included a falsified signature matching the corporate seal, And the email trail shows Chloe Prescott accessed the finance system using a colleague's credentials at the exact moment the transfer was initiated. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd like a whisper through leaves. I felt Richard's hand brush my arm. A brief touch that grounded me. Investigator. The external breach we suspected was a fabrication, intended to mislead the investigation. I swallowed, feeling the weight of those words settle like stone in my gut. The investigator continued, voice steady. Investigator. Both Benjamin Preston and Chloe Preston have been placed on administrative leave pending further review. The room erupted in a flurry of notes and raised hands. I felt a surge of relief mixed with sorrow, a complex tide that threatened to pull me under. I glanced at Owen, who gave a barely perceptible nod. His expression, a mix of sorrow and resolve. A reporter with a bright tie stepped forward, voice eager. Reporter. Mr. Doyle. How does it feel to receive the legacy gift under these circumstances? Owen. I am honored to receive the award. I dedicate it to my father, whose belief in safety at sea guided my work. I hope this recognition encourages others to prioritize the well-being of those who work on the water. His words rang clear, each syllable a quiet promise. I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest, not from pride but from recognition of something genuine. The final question came from a veteran journalist, her tone soft but probing. Reporter. Mrs. Prescott. What do you hope will come from this ordeal for your family? I paused, feeling the weight of every choice that had led us here. I chose my answer with care. Each word, a step toward a future I could not yet see. Eleanor. I hope we learn that honor is not given by name or expectation, but earned through honest action. I hope my son finds the strength to face what he has done. And I hope our family can rebuild on a foundation of truth. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, soft like wind through trees. The press conference began to wind down, reporters gathering their notebooks and equipment. I felt the lingering buzz of cameras fade as the lights dimmed slightly. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm yet gentle. Richard, we will see this through. Together. I nodded, feeling the solidity of his presence anchor me. Owen stepped forward, his voice low as he spoke to Richard. Owen, thank you for giving me the chance to honor my father's legacy. Richard, thank you for reminding us why that legacy matters. I watched the two men exchange a look that spoke of shared loss and quiet resolve. The room emptied slowly, the echo of footsteps fading down the hallway. I lingered a moment longer, staring at the empty chairs where our family had once sat together. A soft chime sounded from my phone resting on the table beside me. I glanced at the screen, seeing a message from Benjamin. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I will make this right. I felt a flicker of something, hope, regret, but I did not reply. Instead, I slipped the phone into my pocket and turned toward the door, the weight of the compass still warm in my palm from earlier. As I stepped into the hallway, the overhead lights flickered once, casting a brief shadow that stretched across the polished floor. In that instant, I felt a resolve settle over me, steady and unyielding. I would face what lay ahead, not as a mother guarding a child, but as a woman devoted to the truth that had guided my husband's life's work. I pushed open the door to the hallway, the glass panels reflecting the dim light of the corridor, and stepped forward, ready for the next step. I will not let this destroy us, I said, my voice low but firm as I stood in the hallway outside the conference room. The glass doors reflected the dim hallway lights, casting a faint glow on the polished floor. Richard stood beside me, his jaw tight, his hands clasped loosely at his sides. Owen lingered a few steps back, his eyes fixed on the distant exit as if weighing his next move. After the press conference dissolved into a hum of reporters packing their gear, I had slipped my phone into my pocket and felt the familiar weight of the compass still warm from earlier. The hallway lights flickered once, casting a thin shadow that stretched across the tiles before fading. I inhaled, feeling the cool air settle in my lungs, and turned to face Richard. Richard, I began, choosing each word carefully. The lender's demand arrived this morning. They want the full amount plus interest within 48 hours. He swallowed, his gaze dropping to the polished floorboards for a heartbeat before lifting to meet mine. We cannot use company funds to cover that, he said, his tone steady, each syllable deliberate. Benjamin must answer for what he has done. I nodded, feeling a steady resolve settle in my chest, not as a flash of anger, but as a quiet certainty. I will arrange for our counsel to review the loan documents. We need to know exactly what we are facing. A soft click echoed from the hallway as James, our legal counsel, appeared, his briefcase held tightly against his side. He glanced at us, his expression calm but attentive. James, I said, stepping slightly to the side so both of us could see his posture. We need to see the paperwork Benjamin used to secure that loan, and we need to know if any company assets were improperly moved. He nodded, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. I have already begun a preliminary review, he said, his voice even. There are discrepancies in the loan agreement that suggest the signatures were not authorized. Richard stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the folder's edge. Show me what you have found, he requested, his voice low but urgent. James flipped open the first page, pointing to a line where a signature appeared. This signature does not match any known specimen from Benjamin's file, he said, tapping the ink with a gloved finger. The loan was dated 2 days after the board meeting, where the legacy gift was announced. Yet the funds were transferred the same day. I felt a coldness settle at the base of my spine. Not a sudden shock, but a steady awareness that something had been concealed. Did Benjamin use any company letterhead for the paperwork? I asked, my eyes never leaving the document. James shook his head slowly. He used a forged letterhead that mimics our corporate seal. The watermark is slightly off, and the font spacing differs by a fraction of a point. Richard's fingers tightened around the folder's edge. We will need to involve the authorities if this is confirmed as fraud, he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. James nodded. I will prepare a statement for the authorities, but first we must secure any remaining assets that could be at risk. I turned toward the office door, the hallway beyond quiet save for the distant hum of the ventilation system. I will increase security on the server room and the finance archive, I said, my voice steady. No one enters without dual authentication. Richard rested his hand on my shoulder, holding it firmly but gently. We will face this together, he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine. I felt a surge of resolve, not a flash of bravado, but a steady determination that steadied my breath. A sudden knock on the office door made both of us turn. The sound was sharp, unexpected, cutting through the low murmur of the air conditioner. Who could be seeking us at this hour? The door opened to reveal Chloe, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She took a shaky breath before speaking. Richard, she said, her voice trembling. Benjamin just called me. He said the lender is threatening to sue the company personally if we do not pay immediately. Richard's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening further. He threatened to expose company secrets? He asked, his voice low but edged with urgency. Chloe nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. He said he would release internal emails if we did not help him. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, not a sudden panic, but a steady awareness of the danger spreading. We will not give in to blackmail, I declared, my voice clear. We will let the law handle this. Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on Chloe's shoulder. We will protect the company and the people who depend on it, he said, his tone firm, but not unkind. Chloe looked between us, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. What about Benjamin? She whispered. He will face the consequences of his actions, Richard replied, his eyes never leaving hers. We will not shield him from the truth. She swallowed hard, then gave a small nod. I will speak with him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I will tell him to stop. I watched her turn and walk down the hallway, her steps slow, each footfall echoing softly against the tile. The office door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Richard, James, and me in the quiet space. James cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to the folder. There is another matter, he said, his tone measured. Our internal security logs show an external intrusion attempt into the finance server 2 nights ago. I felt a prickle at the base of my skull. Not a sudden jolt, but a steady awareness that something else was at play. Who attempted it? Richard asked, his voice low. The attempt came from an IP address that routes through several overseas servers, James replied, tapping a line on the printed log. It appears to be an effort to disguise the origin. His gaze shifted to me. We have increased monitoring and added 2-factor authentication to all critical systems. I nodded, feeling a steady resolve settle deeper. We will not let fear dictate our actions, I said, my voice calm but firm. We will follow the evidence wherever it leads. Richard placed his other hand on the desk, leaning forward slightly. Then let us finish reviewing these documents and prepare our response to the lender. James opened the folder fully, spreading several pages across the desk. The paper rustled softly as he pointed to a series of numbers and dates. The loan amount is $600,000, he said, his tone even. The interest rate is 12% per annum, compounded monthly. I felt a weight settle in my chest. Not a sudden heaviness, but a steady awareness of the magnitude of the situation. The repayment date is set for the 15th of next month, James continued, his finger tracing the line. If we do not meet it, the lender may initiate proceedings to seize company assets. Richard's eyes narrowed as he scanned the document. We have assets that could cover the amount, but using them would set a dangerous precedent. I lifted my gaze from the paper, meeting his eyes. Our reputation is built on transparency and integrity, I said, my voice steady. We must protect that above all. He nodded, his jaw set. We will prepare a formal response that outlines our findings and our refusal to pay under duress. James began to type on his laptop, the soft click of keys filling the quiet office. I watched his hands move, each keystroke deliberate, each word forming a shield against the looming threat. A soft chime sounded from my phone, resting on the desk beside the folder. I looked at the screen and saw a message from Benjamin. I apologize for the pain I caused. I will make this right. I did not reply, instead slipping the phone back into my pocket, feeling its weight against my thigh. The office door opened again, and Owen stepped inside, his expression thoughtful, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He stopped a few feet from the desk, his eyes moving between Richard and me. I have been reviewing the safety protocols for the new training center, he said, his voice calm, each word measured. If there is anything I can do to assist, please let me know. Richard looked up, a faint softening in his gaze. Thank you, Owen, he said. Your father's legacy reminds us why we must stand firm. Owen nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. I will stand with you. The room fell into a quiet rhythm, the hum of the ventilation system the only sound. Besides the occasional keystroke, I felt a steady resolve settle deeper, not a fleeting burst of courage, but a lasting commitment to see this through with honesty and care. As the afternoon light began to slant through the blinds, casting long stripes across the desk, I knew the road ahead would be hard, but I also knew we would walk it together step by step, guided by the truth that had always anchored our family's work. I tightened my grip on the folder as the room fell silent. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to fade under the weight of the papers spread before us. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his eyes scanning the figures with a frown that had not left his face since the morning's call. James typed steadily, the soft click of each key a steady rhythm that filled the quiet. Owen stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze drifting to the street below where the afternoon light painted the pavement gold. I felt the familiar prickle at the base of my skull. A quiet alertness that something needed to be decided now. "We cannot let fear dictate our response," I said, my voice calm but firm. Richard looked up, his jaw tightening slightly. "What do you suggest, Eleanor?" he asked, his tone steady but open. I met his gaze, feeling the weight of the documents and the memory of our family's name. "We must refuse to pay under duress," I said, letting each word settle before the next. "If we give in now, we set a precedent that will invite more attempts to exploit us." Richard nodded slowly, his fingers tapping once on the wood before he spoke. "James, prepare a refusal that outlines our findings and our refusal to comply," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had built a company on integrity. James paused his typing, his eyes lifting from the screen. "I will include the details of the forged documents, the unauthorized loan, and the external intrusion attempt," he replied, his fingers poised over the keys. "I will also note that we have increased security and added two-factor authentication to all critical systems." Owen turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "If there is anything I can do to support the investigation, please let me know," he offered, his voice low and sincere. Richard gave a small nod, his gratitude visible in the slight softening of his eyes. "Thank you, Owen," he said. "Your father's inheritance tells us why we need to stay strong." I felt a surge of resolve, not a fleeting burst of courage, but a steady determination that settled deeper with each breath. The room seemed to hold its breath as James continued to type, the clack of keys punctuating the silence. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands moving steadily toward the hour when the lender's demand would become urgent. A soft chime sounded from my phone, resting beside the folder. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Benjamin. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I will make this right." I did not reply, instead slipping the phone back into my pocket, feeling its weight against my thigh, as a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. James finished typing and pushed the laptop toward Richard. "Here is the draft," he said, his tone neutral. Richard scanned the screen, his eyes moving line by line. He paused at a paragraph that detailed the timeline of the loan and the forged signatures. "This is clear," he murmured, his voice low. "We will not be bullied into compliance." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the desk, and placed my hand over his for a brief moment. "We will protect what we have built," I whispered, feeling the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. Richard squeezed my hand gently before releasing it, his focus returning to the document. The door opened without a knock, and Chloe stepped inside, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She glanced at Owen, then at Richard, and finally at me. "I heard about the meeting," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for any part I played in this." Her words hung in the air, tentative and raw. Richard looked at her, his expression softening just enough to show he heard her regret, but did not waver. "We will address everything through the proper channels," he said, his tone firm yet not unkind. "For now, let us finish this response and send it to the lender." Chloe nodded, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. She turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her. The silence that followed felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what had been said and what remained unsaid. James clicked send, and a soft notification chimed from the laptop. "The response has been sent," he announced, his voice carrying a note of relief. Richard leaned back in his chair, releasing a breath he had been holding for what felt like ages. "Now we wait," he said, his eyes meeting mine. I felt a sudden shift in the air, a tension that was not just waiting but anticipation. The phone on the desk buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. I glanced at it, then at Richard, whose eyebrows rose inquisitive. He nodded toward the device, urging me to see who called. I picked up the phone, the screen flashing with a name I did not expect. Liam Hart, external auditor. My heart gave a quick pulse, not from fear, but from the realization that the investigation was widening beyond our walls. I pressed accept and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady despite the sudden surge of curiosity. A calm voice answered. "Miss Prescott, this is Liam Hart from the Oversight Board. We have received your response and would like to schedule a meeting to discuss the findings and next steps." The words were clear, professional, and carried an undercurrent of authority that made the room feel suddenly smaller. I glanced at Richard, who was already straightening in his chair, his expression shifting from weariness to alertness. "We will be ready to cooperate," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Please let us know a time that works for you." There was a pause on the line, then Liam replied, "Thank you. We will be in touch shortly." The call ended, and the line went silent. I lowered the phone, feeling the weight of the moment settle like a stone in my stomach. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Waiting for the next move, Richard stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked to the window where Owen still stood, looking out at the same golden pavement. "Thank you for your support, Owen," Richard said, his voice genuine. Owen turned, a faint smile touching his lips. "I will do what I can to help," he replied, his tone earnest. As Owen stepped toward the door, I felt a sudden tug at my sleeve. I turned to see Chloe standing there, her eyes red but determined. "I want to make things right," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. "Tell me what I can do." I looked at her, then at Richard, then at Owen, and felt a surge of protectiveness not just for my family but for the principles we had fought to uphold. I placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We will find a way forward together," I said, my voice firm, the words echoing in the quiet office. Just then, the overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied, casting a brief shadow that moved across the desk like a silent warning. The moment hung in the air, and I knew that whatever came next would test everything we had built. A soft hum rose from the ventilation system, pressing against my eardrums. I lowered the phone and felt the weight of the moment settle like a stone in my stomach. Richard rose, his chair making a soft sound on the floor, and moved to the window where Owen remained, gazing out at the identical golden pavement. "Thanks for your help, Owen," Richard said, his voice sincere. Owen turned, a slight smile touching his lips. "I will do what I am able to help," he replied, his tone earnest. As Owen moved toward the door, I sensed a sudden pull at my sleeve. I turned and saw Chloe standing there, her eyes red but resolved. "I wish to fix what went wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. "Tell me what I can do." I looked at her, then at Richard, then at Owen, and felt a surge of protectiveness, not just for my family, but for the principles we had fought to uphold. I put my hand on her shoulder, giving it a soft press. "We will find a path ahead together," I said, my voice firm, the words echoing in the quiet office. Just then, the overhead lights flickered, then flickered again, and then steadied, casting a brief shadow that moved across the desk like a silent warning. The moment lingered in the air, and I understood that what followed would test everything we had built. Richard guided us back to the table where the folder lay open. James lingered nearby, his notebook closed, his expression attentive. Owen pulled a chair closer to the window and sat, his hands resting on his knees. "I have been thinking about how to use the legacy gift," Owen began, his voice low but steady. "Patrick always spoke about safety for those who work on the water. He wanted a place where crews could learn, where families could get help when accidents happen." I watched Owen's eyes drift to the glass, his gaze distant as if he could already see the building he described. "I propose a maritime safety center named after him. It would offer training, equipment checks, and counseling for workers and their families. Richard leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his fingers steepled. That aligns with what the fund was meant to support, he said. The original vision was to reward those who improve lives on the docks, not just line pockets. Owen nodded. I have spoken with a few union leaders. They are eager to partner. They see a need for better rescue drills and mental health resources after long hauls. Chloe shifted in her seat, her hands twisting the edge of her scarf. What about the money? How much will be available for the center? Richard glanced at the document in front of him. The legacy gift amounts to $800,000. A portion is already earmarked for administrative costs of the award process, but the majority can be directed to the center. James cleared his throat. We must ensure the funds are used transparently. An oversight board could track disbursements and outcomes. Owen's smile widened. I would welcome that. Accountability honors Patrick's memory more than any plaque. I felt a quiet pride swell in my chest. Owen spoke not of personal gain, but of community benefit. His words carried the weight of someone who had lived the dangers he sought to prevent. A micro-hook emerged as Owen continued, his voice gaining warmth. If we launched the center within the next year, we could cut response times to man overboard incidents by half, based on data from similar programs elsewhere. The statement hung, a promise that made the room feel lighter, yet charged with purpose. Richard stood again, moving to the sideboard, where a decanter of water sat. He poured 3 glasses, handing one to Owen, one to Chloe, and keeping one for himself. Let us toast to the work ahead, he said, his voice soft but firm. Owen lifted his glass, his eyes meeting mine. To Patrick, to safety, to second chances. Chloe's glass trembled slightly as she touched it to Owen's, then to Richard's, then to mine. She addressed him, and Owen, to new beginnings. The clink was delicate, a sound that seemed to seal a quiet pact. After the toast, Owen unfolded a sketch he had carried in his briefcase. He spread it across the table, the paper crackling softly. Lines formed a building with wide doors, a flagpole bearing a small emblem, and rooms labeled training, equipment, counseling. I traced the edge of the drawing with my fingertip, feeling the slight ridges of the ink. This looks like a place where hope could take root, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Owen nodded. It will be a place where workers know they are not alone when the sea turns cruel. James pointed to a corner of the sketch. Here we could install a simulation tank for drills. It would allow crews to practice without risking lives. Owen's eyes lit up. Exactly. And we could partner with local colleges for research on fatigue and ergonomics. Chloe leaned forward, her curiosity overcoming her earlier distress. Will families be able to stay nearby while training occurs? Owen smiled. We plan modest lodging units, affordable for those who need to be close during certification weeks. Richard placed his hand over the sketch, his palm warm against the paper. We will make sure the center remains true to its purpose. No shortcuts, no ego, just service. I felt a steady resolve settle in my shoulders. The kind that comes when a plan takes shape and feels right. The afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows across the floor. James gathered his notes, his pen clicking. I will draft a memorandum of understanding for the union leaders and start the paperwork for the oversight board. Owen thanked him with a nod. Chloe rose slowly, her steps deliberate. I want to help with the fundraising side, she said, her voice gaining strength. I know people who care about maritime safety. I can reach out. Richard placed a hand on her back, a gesture of reassurance. Your effort will be valued. I watched Chloe's shoulders straighten a fraction, the weight of guilt lifting just enough to let purpose peek through. Owen gathered his sketch, folding it carefully. I will meet with the city council next week to discuss zoning, he said. If they approve, we can break ground before the first frost. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with doubt, but with calculation. We should also consider seasonal staffing. Summer brings more vessels, more need for quick response. Owen agreed. We will hire a core team year-round and bring in seasonal instructors during peak months. I felt a quiet excitement build, the kind that comes when disparate pieces begin to lock into place. As Owen headed for the door, he paused and looked back at Richard. "Thank you for believing in this," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Richard's expression softened. "I believe in what Patrick would have wanted. And I believe in you." Owen gave a small nod and slipped out, the door closing with a muted click. James turned to me, his brow furrowed in thought. "We should also think about a memorial plaque inside the center, something that tells visitors why this place exists." I smiled. A simple inscription, maybe a line from Patrick's favorite poem about the sea. Richard chuckled softly. He loved that line about the tide that carries us home. I felt tears prickle behind my eyes, not from sorrow but from a sense of continuity. The past was not being erased. It was being woven into something that could protect future generations. Chloe lingered by the window, her reflection blending with the golden pavement outside. "I have been thinking about the loan," she said, her voice quieter now. "I want to help Benjamin understand the gravity of what he did, without shielding him from the consequences." Richard's gaze turned contemplative. He must face the outcome of his actions. Protecting him from the truth would only delay his growth. I placed a hand on Chloe's arm, feeling the tension in her muscles ease a fraction. "We can support him in making amends, but we cannot erase the deed." Chloe nodded, her eyes meeting mine. "I will talk to him tomorrow. I will tell him that honesty is the only path forward." Richard stood, his movements deliberate. "Let us end this day with a promise to ourselves. We will build something lasting, not from revenge, but from respect." I lifted my chin, feeling the resolve solidify like stone beneath my fingertips. The office lights steadied, casting a warm glow over the scattered papers, the half-filled glasses, and the sketch of the safety center now resting against the wall. Outside, the distant hum of a ship's horn drifted through the open window, a low note that seemed to echo the promise we had just made. I inhaled, the scent of salt and oil faint but present, and knew that the work ahead would demand every ounce of our courage. Yet it would also offer a chance to heal the wounds that had torn us apart. As the horn faded, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. The tide was turning, and we were ready to meet it head-on. 3 days after the press conference, I felt the weight of silence settle over the house. His response, "I realized that I'm not Dehi." Part 17. The lingering silence of the house weighed heavily 3 days after the press conference. The morning light cast long shadows without the familiar sounds of conversation. Richard stood by the kitchen window, his hands resting on the sill, staring out at the wilting roses in the garden. He did not turn when I entered. "Did you hear from James?" I asked, keeping my voice low, trying not to startle him. He turned his head slowly, his eyes, I thought, watching. He said, "James said they are ready to file the paperwork. The lender will file a claim against the company if we don't settle." I swallowed. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. What does that mean for us? Richard turned fully to me, his expression tight but not unkind. "It means we cannot pay the loan. We have made that clear to James. He will proceed with the legal process." He paused, looking at the floor for a heartbeat. "Benjamin will have to face the consequences himself." A cold knot tightened in my chest. I had imagined many ways this could end, but never the image of my son standing alone in a courtroom, answering for choices he had made in secret. I forced my voice steady. "What will happen to him?" Richard's jaw tightened. "He has been asked to resign his position effective immediately. The board has voted to remove him from the succession plan. He will not receive any further compensation from the company." He lifted his gaze, eyes meeting mine. "He will have to find work elsewhere, and he will be responsible for repaying the loan under the terms he signed. I felt a wave of nausea rise, but I pushed it down. I had to stay present for Richard, for the truth we were trying to uphold. And Chloe? I asked, the name feeling like a stone on my tongue. He exhaled slowly. She told me this morning she is leaving. She said she can no longer live with the shame of what has happened. She is staying with her sister in Portland until she can figure out her next steps. I blinked, the words sinking in. Chloe leaving meant the house would feel even quieter, the emptiness louder. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. Richard moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "We will get through this," he said, his voice low but firm. "We have to remember why we started this company. It was never about profit alone. It was about keeping people safe on the water." He took a sip, his eyes never leaving mine. "We will honor that promise, even if it costs us dearly." I nodded again, feeling the weight of his words settle like a stone in my chest. I wanted to reach out, to tell him I was still his wife, still his partner, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, I lifted the glass and took a slow sip, the cool water grounding me. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the study, the room where Richard kept his old maritime charts, and the model ship he had built for Patrick's birthday. The room smelled of cedar and oil, a reminder of calmer times. I ran my fingers over the spine of a leather-bound logbook, feeling the familiar ridges under my fingertips. The door opened softly, and Richard stepped in, holding a folded piece of paper. He hesitated before speaking. "James emailed me this morning. He said Benjamin has accepted a position at a small freight company in Burlington. It's an entry-level role, no title, no benefits. He will be loading and unloading cargo, working the docks." Richard's voice was rough, as if each word cost him something. "He will also have to start making payments on the loan next month. James said the lender has agreed to a payment plan based on his new income." I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that Benjamin would not be left utterly destitute. Sorrow that the path he now walked was one of humility and hard labor. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Does he know? Does he understand what he has done?" Richard's eyes dropped to the paper in his hand. "He has spoken to James. He said he is sorry, that he never meant to hurt anyone. He knows he has to earn back trust, if it is even possible." He looked up, his gaze meeting mine. "I told him we will not interfere. He must make his own way." I felt tears prickle behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had spent years trying to shield my son from the harsh realities of the world, and now I saw the cost of that protection. I nodded once more, my throat tight. "I will pray for him," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. Richard put his hand on my shoulder, his grip strong yet soft. "We will keep the company true to its purpose," he said. "We will honor Patrick's memory by building something that lasts." He glanced toward the window where the sailboat we kept for weekend trips bobbed gently at the dock. "And we will remember that the sea does not forgive arrogance." The late afternoon light slanted across the floor, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the door. I heard a soft click from the hallway, the front door opening and closing. I turned just in time to see Chloe's silhouette disappear down the walk, her suitcase rolling softly behind her. She did not look back. The door clicked shut, leaving a quiet that felt both final and uneasy. I stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant cry of a gull, the faint creak of the house settling. My thoughts drifted to the model ship on the shelf, its tiny sails frozen in a moment of calm. I thought of the years we had spent building this life, the late nights spent poring over ledgers, the laughter shared over dinner, the quiet of the sea-salted evenings. I thought of the promise Richard had just made, the weight of responsibility settling on our shoulders like a tide pulling in. I turned away from the window and walked back to the living room, sinking into the worn armchair that had held us through so many storms. I pulled a blanket over my legs, feeling the wool scratch against my skin. The house felt emptier, but there was a strange steadiness in the air, as if the foundation had been tested and found wanting, yet still standing. Later that evening, Richard joined me in the room, his steps soft on the polished wood. He sat beside me, not speaking at first, just letting the silence fill the space between us. After a while, he turned his head toward me, his eyes tired but sincere. "I know it hurts," he said, his voice low. "But we have to let him learn. We cannot keep pulling him back from the fire." I nodded, feeling a tear finally slip down my cheek, warm and unexpected. I wiped it quickly. I reached for his hand, our fingers intertwining briefly before I pulled away, needing to feel the solidity of the wood beneath my palms, the solidity of the choice we had made. The night deepened, the house settling into a quiet rhythm. I listened to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second a reminder that time moved forward regardless of our pain. I thought of the sea, of its relentless tide, of how it shapes the shore, even when it seems to recede. I hoped, with a quiet fervor that surprised me, that the tide would one day bring my son back to shore, not as a prodigal son returning with riches, but as a man who had learned the weight of his own actions and the value of honest work. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness wrap around me, and whispered a promise to myself. I would face each day with honesty. I would support Richard in rebuilding what we could, and I would pray for the strength to let go of what I could not control. The house remained still, the only sound the steady tick of the clock, marking the passage of moments that would, someday, lead to healing. "Richard, we have to face the press together," I said, keeping my voice steady as we walked down the hall toward the conference room. The polished floor reflected the soft glow of the sconces, and a faint scent of lemon polish lingered in the air. Richard nodded, his jaw tight but his eyes focused on the doors ahead. He placed a hand on the brass push plate, pausing for a breath before pushing them open. Inside, rows of chairs faced a raised platform where a single microphone stood. Cameras on tripods pointed toward the space, their lenses catching the light like wary eyes. A low murmur rose from the gathered journalists, a rustle of notebooks and the occasional click of a pen. I took a seat near the aisle, my hands folded in my lap, and watched Richard walk to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, glanced at the crowd, and began to speak. "Thank you all for coming," Richard said, his voice clear despite the tension that threaded through it. "Today we address matters that have affected our family and our company." He paused, letting the words settle. The legacy gift awarded to Owen Doyle was decided by an independent committee, free from any familial influence. He glanced toward Owen, who sat in the front row, hands resting calmly on his knees. Owen gave a small nod, his expression solemn but composed. A reporter leaned forward, her notebook poised. "Mrs. Prescott, can you confirm that your son Benjamin had no role in the decision?" she asked. I felt a flutter in my chest, but I kept my gaze level. "Benjamin had no part in the selection process," I replied. "The committee acted independently, as they always have." My voice did not shake, though the memory of Benjamin's recent text pressed against my thoughts like a dull ache. Another journalist, older with a salt and pepper beard, shifted his weight. "What about the loan that Benjamin secured using forged documents?" he asked. Richard's shoulders tightened, just a fraction. "We have uncovered evidence that Benjamin attempted to obtain funds by misrepresenting company assets," he said. "Those actions are contrary to everything we stand for." He looked directly at the camera, his stare steady. "We will cooperate fully with any investigation and will not shield anyone from accountability." A murmur rippled through the room. I sensed the weight of each word settling on the shoulders of those listening. My mind drifted to the evening before, when I had stood in the hallway and heard the front door click shut after Chloe's departure. The quiet that followed had felt both final and uneasy, yet now a different kind of quiet pressed in, one of anticipation. A young reporter with a bright red scarf raised her hand. "Miss Prescott, do you believe your son will face consequences?" she asked. I swallowed, feeling the dryness in my throat. "I hope he learns from this," I said. "I hope he chooses." The conference continued, each question peeling back another layer of the story. Richard answered with measured candor. Owen listened attentively, and I observed the way the light caught the silver threads in Owen's hair as he shifted slightly in his seat. The atmosphere grew heavier with each revelation, yet there was also a strange clarity, as if the fog that had obscured our vision was beginning to lift. Around the midpoint of the session, a reporter asked about the maritime safety center Owen planned to build. Owen's face lit up just a touch. "The center will honor my father's legacy by providing training and resources for workers at sea," he said. "It will focus on prevention, readiness, and community support." His voice carried a quiet determination that stayed with me, with the audience. I felt a flicker of hope amid the tension. The idea of something constructive rising from the wreckage reminded me of the tide that reshapes the shore even after a storm. I glanced at Richard, whose expression had softened just enough to show he, too, saw the possibility of renewal. When the final question was posed, about whether the company would implement stricter oversight, Richard answered without hesitation. "Yes," he said. "We are reviewing our procedures to ensure transparency and integrity at every level." He turned his gaze toward me for a brief moment, and I saw in his eyes the same resolve that had guided us through countless challenges. The conference ended with a flurry of shutter clicks and reporters gathering their belongings. As the crowd began to disperse, Owen approached us, his steps measured. He stopped a few feet away, looking first at Richard, then at me. "Thank you for letting me share my father's vision," Owen said, his voice low but sincere. "I will work hard to make sure it serves those who need it most." Richard placed a hand on Owen's shoulder. "We will support you in any way we can," he replied. "The sea respects those who respect it." Owen nodded, then turned his gaze toward me. "And thank you, Eleanor, for your steadiness." He gave a small smile before walking toward the exit, his coat swaying slightly with each step. I watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. The hall emptied, leaving behind an echo of voices and the soft hum of the ventilation system. Richard slipped his arm around mine, his grip firm yet comforting. "We have a lot of work ahead," he murmured, "but we will face it together." I leaned into his side, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my arm. The moment felt like a promise, not just to each other, but to the principles that had always guided us. As we stepped out into the late afternoon light, a sudden shout stopped us in our tracks. A voice, raw and urgent, called from the parking lot. "Benjamin! Benjamin Prescott! Wait!" We turned to see Benjamin standing near his car, his face pale, his hands gripping the keys tightly. Chloe was nowhere in sight. His breath came in short bursts, and his eyes darted between us and the growing crowd of onlookers that had begun to form. "Please," Benjamin said, his voice cracking. "I need to say something." He swallowed hard, his throat working as if each word were a stone. "I lied about the loan. I forged the papers. I promised repayment with money that was never mine to give." His gaze flicked to Richard, then to me, then to the cameras that had begun to swivel toward him. Drawn by the unfolding scene, a hush fell over the plaza. The reporters' murmurs faded, replaced by the sharp intake of breath. As they sensed the gravity of his confession, I felt a coldness spread through my chest, not from anger, but from the stark reality of his words breaking into the open. Richard stepped forward, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Benjamin," he said, "you have spoken the truth now. We will let the process take its course." Benjamin's shoulders slumped, and he lowered his head, the weight of his admission visibly pressing upon him. A reporter rushed forward. Microphone extended. "Mr. Prescott, can you confirm that you will cooperate with the investigation?" Benjamin looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Yes," he said quietly. "I will." The moment hung in the air, a stark contrast to the carefully staged press conference just minutes before. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement, as if marking the line between what had been hidden and what was now exposed. I stepped toward him, my voice low but firm. Richard stood beside me, his jaw tight, but his eyes steady. Benjamin looked at the ground, his hands still clasped around the car keys. I waited a breath before speaking, letting the silence settle between us. "You have spoken the truth now," Richard said, his tone calm but edged with resolve. "We will let the process take its course." Benjamin lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed from the confession. "I know I have broken trust," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. "I do not expect forgiveness." I felt a surge of something I could not name, but I kept my face neutral. "Forgiveness is not given lightly," I said, choosing each word carefully. "It is earned through actions, not just words." Richard nodded, his gaze shifting to the empty parking lot where reporters had begun to pack their gear. "You have resigned," he reminded Benjamin. "You must repay the loan through honest work." Benjamin swallowed, the sound audible in the quiet. "I have taken a position at a small freight company," he said. "It is humble, but it is honest." I glanced at Richard, seeing the same resolve that had guided us through countless challenges. "You will work there without special titles or privileges," I stated. "Your salary will go first to the debt you owe." Benjamin's shoulders slumped further, but he did not look away. "I will repay every cent," he promised. "I will not ask for help from the company." Richard placed a hand on my back, his touch firm yet gentle. "We will not interfere," he said. "Your path is yours to walk alone." A soft wind stirred the newspaper scraps near the curb, carrying a faint scent of salt from the distant bay. I wondered if the wind carried away some of the weight we had carried for so long. Benjamin lifted his chin, meeting my eyes for the first time since his confession. "I will prove myself," he said, his voice gaining a hint of determination. "Not for you, but for the name I bear." I felt a flicker of something like hope, but I kept my expression steady. "Prove it to yourself," I replied. "That is the only audience that matters now." Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on Benjamin's shoulder. "We will watch from a distance," he said. "If you stay true, the road may open again." Benjamin nodded, the movement small but sincere. "Thank you," he whispered, "for the chance, even if it feels like a sentence." I turned to Richard, seeing the exhaustion etched into his face, yet also a steadiness that had never left him. "We have done what we could," I murmured. "Now we let the consequences shape him." He squeezed my shoulder, his grip warm. "We have upheld the values we built this company on," he said. "That is enough for now." A distant siren wailed, rising and falling like a reminder that the world kept moving regardless of our personal storms. I listened to its rhythm, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease just a fraction. Benjamin stepped back toward his car, his steps slower than before. He opened the door, slid inside, and closed it with a soft click. The engine turned over, a low growl that faded as he pulled away from the curb. I watched his taillights disappear down the street, the red lights blinking like a distant warning. Richard slipped his arm around mine, pulling me close. "We will keep the course steady," he whispered into my ear. I leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my arm. The afternoon light stretched long across the pavement, casting shadows that seemed to hold their breath. The low rumble of a ship's horn vibrated through my chest as I stood on the dock, the salty wind pulling at my coat. Owen was already there, his hands busy with a coil of rope near the newly painted sign that read Patrick Doyle Maritime Safety Center. I stepped closer, the wooden planks warm under my shoes from the morning sun. "Morning, Owen," I said. my voice steady despite the flutter in my throat. He turned, a smile spreading across his face that reached his eyes. "Good morning, Eleanor," he replied, wiping his palms on his jeans. "I was just checking the moorings. The tide's coming in fast today." I nodded, watching the water lap against the pilings. "It looks ready. The volunteers arrived early, didn't they?" He gestured toward a cluster of people in bright vests unloading boxes from a trailer. "Yes. They're setting up the first aid station. We've got the simulators installed, and the classroom is ready for next week's training." A sense of pride settled in my shoulders, quiet and warm. "You've done remarkable work in such a short time." He laughed softly, the sound barely audible over the gulls. "It's a team effort. Richard helped with the paperwork, and the union gave us access to the old warehouse. Even James stopped by yesterday to review the safety protocols." I felt a tug at my memory, the image of Richard's stern face during those late-night meetings. "He believes in this cause, Owen. He always has." Owen's gaze drifted to the horizon where a freighter painted in Prescott marine colors was making its slow passage. "He once told me his father used to say, 'A captain's true measure isn't the tonnage he moves but the lives he keeps safe.' I think he's finally internalizing that truth." A micro-hook formed in my mind. What would Richard say if he could hear those words now? I pushed the thought aside and focused on the present. "Speaking of Richard," I began, my hands finding the railing. "He asked me to bring you something today." I reached into my tote and pulled out a folded piece of canvas, the fabric soft from years of use. "He wanted you to have this." Owen took the cloth, his fingers tracing the faded emblem stitched in the corner, a small anchor entwined with a rope. His breath caught, and for a moment he said nothing, eyes fixed on the symbol. "This was Patrick's," he whispered, voice thick. "He used it on his first boat, the one he built with his own hands after the storm took his brother." I watched his throat work as he swallowed. He kept it in his desk drawer all these years, never letting it leave his sight. Owen lifted the cloth to his chest, pressing it gently against his heart. "He always said the sea gives and takes, but it's the people who steer the boat that matter." He looked up, meeting my gaze. "Thank you, Eleanor, for remembering him." I felt a warmth spread through my ribs, not just from the sun, but from the shared understanding that stretched between us. "He would be proud of what you're building." A distant horn sounded again, deeper this time, and a flock of terns rose from the water, their wings flashing silver in the light. Owen smiled, a quiet determination settling in his features. "We'll open the doors next month," he said, turning back to the work crew. "First class will be for the dock workers' kids. We'll teach them how to read the weather, how to tie a proper knot, how to rescue a mate who's gone overboard." I stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing more than teaching skills. You're giving them a reason to trust the sea again." He nodded, his grip firm on my hand for a heartbeat before he let go. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll keep another family from getting the call that changes everything." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of diesel and fresh paint. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years lift just a fraction. The day stretched ahead, full of hammer blows and shouted instructions, but the air felt lighter, as if the tide itself was turning. A sudden shout broke the rhythm. A young woman dropped a crate, and two men rushed to help her up. Laughter followed, rough and genuine. I watched them, the way they checked each other's gloves, the way they exchanged a quick nod before getting back to work. Owen caught my eye and raised his thumb in a silent salute. I returned the gesture, my heart full. Later, after the crew had taken a break for lunch, I found myself walking toward the main office where Richard liked to sit when he visited. The door stood ajar, and inside I saw him at the desk, his hands resting on a blank sheet of paper. The lobcloth lay folded neatly beside him, the anchor emblem catching the light. He looked up as I entered, his eyes softening. "She brought it to you," he said, voice low. I stepped closer, seeing the way his fingers trembled slightly as they touched the cloth. "He would have liked this place," I murmured. Richard's gaze drifted to the window where the safety center's flag snapped in the breeze. "He would have liked seeing his son's name on the door," he replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "And he would have liked knowing someone else is watching over the water." I placed my hand over his, feeling the steady beat of his pulse against my palm. "We're keeping his promise, Richard." He squeezed my hand back, his grip warm. "And we're making sure the next generation knows what it means to honor a name." Outside, the ship's horn sounded once more, long and resonant, echoing across the water like a vow renewed. The horn's low note lingered over the water as I turned away from the yard and headed toward the narrow lane that led to my cottage. The paint on the boards still smelled fresh, but the scent of salt and seaweed seemed stronger now, as if the tide had washed something clean ashore. I pushed open the gate and paused on the porch, watching the dock workers' children cluster around Owen's makeshift bench, their small hands fumbling with rope, while he corrected a knot with a patient smile. I felt the urge to join them, not to instruct but to learn, and I slipped off my shoes, feeling the worn wood beneath my bare feet. Inside, the office door was still ajar, the anchor cloth folded neatly on Richard's desk. I picked it up, the fabric soft against my palms, and carried it to the window where the safety center's flag snapped in the breeze. Instead of laying it down, I draped it over the back of the chair where I used to sit when I first came here, the place where I had plotted my revenge. The cloth settled, its emblem catching the light, and I sat, letting the silence settle with it. I reached for the notebook I kept for tide charts and began to write. Not plans, not names, but the sound of the horn, the laughter of the children, the way Owen's thumb had brushed mine in salute. Each line felt like a rope being pulled taut, then loosened, the tension easing with every word. When the afternoon waned, I walked down to the pier where the young woman who had dropped the crate was now helping a boy tie a figure eight. I handed her a spare length of rope, and she glanced up, eyes bright, before looping it around her wrist and pulling tight. She laughed, a short, genuine sound that rose above the gulls, and I found myself laughing with her, the sound raw and unguarded. Later, as the light turned gold and the harbor lights flickered on, I stood at the rail watching the water swallow the last of the sun. The weight that had once clenched my chest felt less like a stone and more like a tide pulling back, leaving space for something else to flow in. I tucked the notebook under my arm and headed home, the anchor cloth folded neatly in my bag. I did not look back at the dockyard with the intent of settling scores. I looked forward to the next morning's hammer blows, the next knot to be taut, the next story that might be whispered over a cup of tea. If you have ever felt the sea give you a second chance, I would love to hear yours. The horn's fading note reminded you that revenge is a heavy anchor, dragging you beneath the surface while the world above keeps moving. When you chose to set aside the notebook of plans, and instead felt the worn wood under your bare feet, you began to untie the knot of bitterness that had tightened around your chest. Watching Owen's patient correction of a frayed rope, you saw that mastery comes not from force, but from gentle repetition, and that teaching is really a form of learning. Draping the anchor cloth over the chair where you once plotted retaliation turned a symbol of burden into a reminder of safety, showing you that objects can hold new meaning when you shift your perspective. Handing the young woman a spare length of rope and hearing her genuine laugh taught you that small gestures can repair what silence has broken, and that the sea's tide offers a natural metaphor for letting go. What was once a stone in your chest becomes water that recedes, making space for new growth. As you walked home with the cloth folded in your bag, you carried forward the quiet promise to meet each morning's hammer blows with openness rather than retaliation. What moment has the sea, or any steady rhythm in your life, given you a chance to rewrite your story? I would love to hear how you turned a tide of resentment into a tide of renewal.